And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. This is a long-awaited stream, one I've worked on for quite some time. Today is the day to finally present it. We are going to be talking about Gaza. We're going to go over the death toll, the civilian-to-combatant ratio. We're going to investigate alleged war crimes, and more. Once the stream is done, it'll turn into a call-in show, or once my presentation is done, this will turn into a call-in show, and anybody is invited on to ask questions or challenge me. I've put some of these thoughts and ideas out before because I wanted to see what pushback I receive. I don't have any interest in just trying to prove a point that maybe I believed was right. I've spent months trying to disprove what I believed was right, as I believe anyone who cares about truth should do. And I also want to thank those who gave me pushback, because in pushing back on my claims, you helped me better understand them. So we're going to review them. Depending on who you ask, you will hear very different narratives about Gaza. One side will say, Israel's engaging in the best way possible, lowest civilian to combatant ratio in modern history. They're essentially achieving a new standard of urban warfare. This is what we're hearing from one side. The other side is saying that the IDF are essentially Nazis that are currently genociding the Palestinians. In reality, as with most things, it seems the truth is somewhere in between. Though that being said, it's not like the conclusions I reached are so favorable for the pro-Israel side. And I say this as somebody who in no way hates Israel. I am Israeli. The conclusions I reached, in short, are that we are seeing a level of force being used in Gaza unseen in recent history. We're seeing a higher civilian to combatant death ratio above the global average, despite what many are saying. We're seeing a level of children being killed, unlike which we've seen in recent history, and what I would describe as an unprecedented amount of war crimes being committed. Now, I will get into the evidence of all of these claims, and there will be sources in the description for everything, for any claim I make. Now, it's important to make clear that while we're seeing unprecedented levels of harm being caused towards Palestinians, we're also seeing the most challenging fighting conditions in recent history. Maybe in history. I don't think there's ever been urban warfare that has been this challenging, where you have a militant group that is hiding in tunnels underneath a densely populated city, and Israel's mission is to destroy that militant group. It's a very difficult challenge. Now, according to both international law and common sense, the fact that it's a challenge does not absolve Israel of responsibility. The warring party still needs to take precautions to reduce civilian harm, and we have mountains of evidence at this point that is not what is happening. Sure, we do have some instances where we can see an attempt to reduce harm, but by and large, we are not seeing the precaution that I believe most people in the world, as well as the international courts, will determine is an acceptable amount of precaution relative to the harm being caused. And this stream actually coincides quite coincidentally with the ICC issuing an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. I actually have not looked into the arrest warrant yet. It's still morning where I am. I saw the headlines, so we won't get deep into that, but that is some interesting timing. I already see some commenters are already getting upset. Scarlett, I'm sorry that you struggle, that we're talking about some horrific things the country we're both a citizen of are doing, but the truth must come out. And I think that's brings me to an important point. Why am I doing this? Why am I coming on stream and speaking bad about a country I'm a citizen of, a country that I actually love, a country that my whole family lives in? Well, I feel a moral obligation. I served in the IDF. I'm a citizen of Israel. I pay taxes to that government. I feel a moral obligation to speak out against what I consider to be some of the most horrific atrocities of the 21st century. And the evidence of this is overwhelming. I'm not just being hyperbolic. We'll get into this. So I feel a moral obligation. I also want people to have a realistic understanding of the cost of this war. Right? There's a lot of misinformation. Many people think this is the best fought war in modern history, that for each combatant killed, there's one civilian killed. Well, none of that is actually true. So if people want to support the war, I would like for them to have a realistic understanding of the cost of this war. And honestly, I want to see Israel thrive. Israel is a country that I lived in for half my life. My entire family lives there. Most of my family relies on the state of Israel for protection. I don't want to see Israel destroyed. I want to see Israel thrive, but I believe she's headed down a dark path, and only through having these challenging conversations can we hope to transform Israel positively. And more than anything, I really just want to see peace on the land. I want to see a future where Israelis and Palestinians are living side by side in peace with one another, and I believe that to be possible. Now, as I'm saying a lot of this, many of you may be saying, wait a minute, I saw an article by John Spencer, West Point Urban Warfare Studies. He says something completely different. Yeah. Spencer, and I don't say this word lightly, he is a fraud. And I'm not gonna, this video won't be about John Spencer on his own, but you will see how many of the claims he makes are just inaccurate and dishonest. I may make a video down the line specifically about John Spencer. And the reason I'm mentioning him is because he's the #1 cited person for those trying to defend Israel's actions in Gaza. They believe there is a person from a place of authority who is saying this is the best fought war in history. They use him as an authority. Now, it's interesting because you can't imagine a situation where a West Point guard is going to accuse Israel of committing war crimes. Like, that's just a very unlikely scenario. Now, that doesn't mean that John Spencer shouldn't be trusted because he works at West Point, but him working at West Point does not give him any authority on the matter. His claims should be judged on their merit, as all claims, as with my claims. The fact that I served in the IDF don't give me any more legitimacy to be making these claims. Yeah, it did give me some insight as to the culture of the IDF. It allowed me to speak to friends who served in Gaza to get a greater insight. But the results I reached are primarily a result of just doing research on available information. So do not take my word for what I'm saying. You can fact check me, reach your own conclusions. That's essential, no matter who you're hearing information from. Now, what methodology did I use to reach conclusions? Because it's very hard to know what's true in the fog of war. Most of what's happening is not being recorded, so we don't have a full picture. We need to use the data we have available to us. So the data we have available to us is in the form of photos and videos from IDF soldiers, from drones, from satellites, as well as from Gazans. We have testimonials from IDF whistleblowers, journalists, and doctors, as well as Gazans. I'm relying heavily on data that is verifiable, right? So we'll often hear a claim made by Israel or a claim made by Hamas. These claims without verifiable data, I take with a grain of salt, especially during times of war. Warring parties have an incentive to frame things to their benefit. This is not just a war for military gain, but also for PR. So again, if I'm not going to use anything that Israel says or that Hamas says at face value, there would need to be corresponding evidence to back up that claim. I try to look for different forms of evidence to corroborate claims, right? So let's say we get a testimonial from an IDF whistleblower. That testimonial has no other evidence to back it up, like other testimonials, like photo or video evidence. Then I also take that with a grain of salt, because technically a whistleblower could be lying. So I try to look for corroborating evidence for any claim being made. I also look at the motivations and incentives at play, right? What are the incentives at play? How does this impact both sides and the decisions that they make? I think this is essential. Doing all of this can allow us to get a relatively clear picture of what's going on It does not give us the exact numbers of those killed. You'll see I'm going to present a range. The size of that range is really a result of not having all the information. Right, so let's really talk about that range. Right, how many civilians have been killed in Gaza? We really don't know. But I estimate that it is between 50,000 to 150,000 civilians. Now, this may surprise many because both the Gaza Ministry of Health and the UN are saying, wait, it's only 43,000. So how are you going to say it's more than what the Gaza Ministry of Health is saying? Well, this really comes from really a lack of understanding of the MOH and their methodology. It's not that they're saying 43,000 have been killed. They're saying 43,000 have been confirmed killed. That's very different. Generally, in times of war, it takes many months to years to identify all those being killed. We've seen record levels of infrastructural damage in Gaza, so we do not know how many people are unaccounted for or buried under rubble. And we also, these 43,000 are not including indirect deaths, those dying from the collapse of the healthcare system, from disease and malnutrition. And the way we know these are not being included is because if they were including indirect deaths, we would see an unusual spike in deaths amongst babies and elderly. We do not see this spike. Now, how do we even know if we could trust these names being released? This is actually, there's this massive misconception, and I was actually surprised to discover this myself. The Gaza Ministry of Health is actually quite meticulous in the reporting, more meticulous than any other Ministry of Health is during wartime. And we actually have a unique situation where the warring party has access to the population registry of the other side. This does not exist generally in conflict. So generally, when you want to know casualty count, you need to blindly trust the side reporting on the numbers. But in the case of Israel and Gaza, we don't need to blindly trust, because every name and ID that the Ministry of Health releases exists in the Palestinian population registry, which is controlled by Israel. Israel can very easily cross-reference and see that these names are real and that these people exist. And if they were fabricating, we would hear about this from Israel. It wouldn't even take an intelligence unit to do it. A low-level bureaucrat can do this. Somebody from the Ministry of Interior could do this as a passion project. It would not be hard to discredit this list. Now, I've been trying to look, we know that the Ministry of Health has verifiable data, and we also know that they're historically reliable. Their numbers are generally similar to what the IDF themselves will claim, and they are also similar to what human rights organizations will say, historically speaking. Now, I have been trying to look for other vectors of fabrication. If the Ministry of Health was really trying to cheat the numbers, how would they do it? So we're going to go through different ways they could potentially fabricate, and none of them really are compelling. Some of them are quite conspiratorial, and it's a whole lot of effort to go through with relatively little to gain. It also shouldn't be hard to believe, like, you have 2.5 million people living in Gaza. 85,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza. That's more than all the major cities in World War II. That's a tiny place for a whole lot of explosives. So the fact that we're not at hundreds of thousands dead very well may be a sign, or is a sign, that Israel is not trying to maximize civilian deaths, as many claim. They're not. They're using heavy amounts of firepower in areas that are, let's say, 80% clear of civilians, right? Or 90% clear of civilians. A lot of their heaviest firepower are being used in those areas, but it's still costing the lives of many. So the fact that they've used 85,000 tons of explosives and only killed 50 to 150,000 is a sign on one hand that they're not trying to maximize civilian harm. On the other hand, it is demonstrating a level of aggression and force unlike which we've seen in recent conflicts. And it shouldn't be so surprising, the death toll we're currently seeing. But let's look at these potential rooms for fabrication. So they can't just fake names because Israel could easily prove that. But what if they were putting people who are still alive, right? Let's say people are living, they just add them to the list to add the numbers. Well, if they were doing this in any meaningful way, meaning like adding thousands of people, we would see some evidence of this. All it would take is the IDF to arrest one person, or get a video or photo of a single person, social media activity of a person, have somebody from Gaza come out and say, why am I on the list? The idea of adding thousands of live people on the list with no evidence is highly unlikely. It really is. I mean, Gaza's there's a lot of surveillance of Gaza. There's a lot of intel. This whole idea that we could add thousands of living people to the list and there wouldn't be a shred of evidence. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible, but the likelihood is very low. And again, we're getting conspiratorial in order to believe such a thing. But again, the chance of them actually doing that while they're under so much, right? The Gaza Ministry of Health and the healthcare system is under immense amounts of pressure. They're not even able to report properly on everything happening, which is another reason to think that what they've reported is only really talking about some amount of the total amount of deaths. Like they don't have the capacity to have a functioning reporting system like they normally do because of the damage their healthcare system has taken. So to think, given all this strain, they're also now just going through the Palestinian population registry and trying to take living people and add them to the list. They don't know, are these people under arrest in Israeli prison, which would very easily prove that they're lying. Like the idea of them doing this effectively during time of war is just so unlikely. But I do know people really, really try to cast doubt on anything they say and are looking for any way to discredit them because they don't want to believe that these numbers are real. So that's why I'm going through this, because I already know the pushback that's going to be received because people have already given this pushback. Now, what's another way they could manipulate? So we've found some inconsistencies in the data, right? So in April, they released a list, and there were they released a list every few months. So they released one in April, and then they released one in June. In April, there was incomplete data. There was some amount of the names that had incomplete data. So people saw this, and then in June, they released the list, and they filled out and updated and completed all the missing data. People saw this as a sign. It's like, oh, look, they're just making up claims. Now, if they could just make up names and ID numbers, why would they in any way, shape, or form put incomplete data in when they're under the public scrutiny? If they could just make up names and ID numbers, there's no reason they would release a list with incomplete data. The fact that they updated it to complete the data shows they're trying to be as accurate as possible. And so the accusation that because they have updated data, therefore they're making the data up is not really a coherent hypothesis. Not to mention, before they released the list in April, they did go on the record saying we're going to release this list with incomplete data, and they explained why. They said our systems are not functioning properly. We're trying to put together a report as best we can, but it's incomplete. They actually came out and said that before doing it, and then in June, upon having time to complete the numbers, they updated it all. If anything, this points to a level of an effort of trying to be as accurate as possible. Now, I think they made a mistake. I don't think they should have released any incomplete data because they're under public scrutiny and people do use this against them. Another thing we are hearing, that another vector for fabrication, we're saying, how do we know that Hamas aren't killing some of these people and that they're being added to the list? Well, that actually might be happening, right? The Ministry of Health are adding to the list bodies that have been seen, dead bodies have been seen. If Hamas kills somebody and they come into the hospital, they see somebody shot, they very well may assume that's the IDF. So there is reason to believe that some amount of those killed have been killed either directly by Hamas or by misfired rockets. But when you look at what amount of deaths that would constitute, it's actually negligible. It's negligible. One way to look at it, we often hear 20% of all rockets fall within Gaza and they kill massive amounts of civilians. The evidence doesn't really back that up. The evidence does not back that up at all. One way to look at this is during the 2021 war. We saw that at least Israel claims, and let's take their word for it, Israel claims that 13 people were killed from Hamas rockets. Now, less rockets were shot, but if we think it's going to have a similar death rate than it did in 2021. Now, if we correct for the amount of rockets being killed, we're talking about max of like 100 to 200 people. And we don't have evidence of Hamas massacring hundreds or even thousands of their own people currently. There's zero evidence of this. And if that were to be the case, we would see evidence. We'd have testimonials, we'd have video and photo evidence of massive amounts of people being killed in a way that will impact the data. So I actually think there very well may be a case where people being killed by Hamas have been added to this list, but we're talking about a negligible amount that constitutes less than 1% or 1%. So it's not changing the data in any meaningful way. Now, how do I arrive at this civilian, this estimate of civilians? Because they're not differentiating between combatants and civilians, right? So let's look at the numbers the Ministry of Health releases. They say that 43,000 civilians have been killed, but of those, 34,344 have been fully identified. We have their name and ID number. So when they release the list, they're releasing the list of 34,344. When we look at the demographics of that list, we see that 58% are women and children. It's fair to assume that the overwhelming majority of women and children are civilians. We often hear claims of child soldiers, but we actually have not seen much evidence of child soldiers, not enough to change the data in a meaningful way. And one way to look at that, if we compare the amount of girls that have been killed to the amount of boys that have been killed, you've only had 1,400 more boys killed than girls. So we could assume that those 1,400 boys were militants, but we also know in times of war, men and teenage boys are often killed at a higher rate because they're confused of being militants and they're taking risks like going out to get food and water. This is true of every conflict in recent history. Civilian men die at a higher rate as civilian women. This is true of teenage boys as well. And we also see a similar differential when we look at elderly men and elderly women. So we could assume that those 1,400 or so boys are militants, but in reality, it's likely significantly less than that because we know they're likely to be killed. They're more likely to be killed. So of this list, 48,000 are women, children. Sorry, of this list, 58% are women, children, and elderly. So we have 42% are men. How many of those men are civilian? It's really hard to know, but we can assume that if we assume that civilian women and civilian men are dying at a similar rate, then we would get to 78% of this list being civilians. That's if they're dying at the same rate. I don't see any reason to believe that civilian women are dying at a higher rate. I've not yet heard a compelling hypothesis for that being the case. And it's not true about any armed conflict. Other armed conflicts, and there will be a source to this, as with all other things I'm saying, all other armed conflicts have civilian men dying at a rate that is 30% all the way to 890% more than women. So this list, these 34,344 names is anywhere between 78% civilians all the way to 95+% civilians. Again, the reason we have that range is because we don't know at what rate men are being killed, at what rate higher they're being killed than civilian women. We do have reason to believe, though, that like in all other conflicts, men are being killed at a higher rate. I'm going to read a testimonial from a whistleblower. This is an IDF soldier that served in the IDF. B said that it was difficult to distinguish civilians from combatants in Gaza, claiming that members of Hamas often walk around without their weapons. But as a result, every man between the age of 16 and 50 is suspected of being a terrorist, right? So this speaks to the challenging conditions, the fact that because of how Hamas operate, it is a very challenging operation, but this also points to the fact that men are being targeted. Military-age men are being targeted. We also see more evidence of this by the mass arrests of military-age men. Many of them we know are innocent because they get released days or weeks after they get arrested, and because their family members come out and pointing to the fact that they're just doctors or they do this, and we're getting a lot of testimonials that they have zero connection to Hamas. Do we need to believe the family members? No, but this is corroborated both by the fact that many of them are being released after some time, and by the fact that, if you don't know who's Hamas and who's not, and you want to play it safe, then you're going to suspect every military-age man. And this really, really speaks to like the and we'll get deeper into this, but the how both sides are looking at this, right? Israel cares first and foremost about their soldiers and civilians. If that comes at the expense of harming civilians on the other side, that is a decision they are going to make. And this is true of every country. Every country is going to prefer their soldiers over the civilians of an enemy. This is why we have and need international law to protect civilians of the opposing side. And we will get more into that. Now, so how do we reach 50 to 150,000? Well, if we were to assume, let's say that 90% of the list are civilians. Now, again, it could be less, it could be more. This is an estimate, but you'll see the range I give accounts for all of this. Then we have around 30,000 civilian deaths. But as I mentioned earlier, we know in war that many, if not most of those killed, take a while to be identified. They may be under rubble. They may not yet be accounted for. Less than half the hospitals in Gaza are currently operational. Also, the hospitals that are operational are just completely over capacity. So you could see a situation, let's say somebody is killed. What is the point of the family even bringing them into the hospital? They may just be burying them. So we don't know how many people are being buried without going to the hospital, right? So it's possible that the majority of those killed have not yet been accounted for. It might not be the majority. We really don't know. Again, that's why I'm estimating this wide range between 50 to 150,000. We also know that there are some amount of indirect deaths. You have widespread malnutrition and disease in Gaza, and you don't have the medical infrastructure to deal with all these people. This will primarily impact babies and elderly. The Ministry of Health did say that they are going to release a list of indirect deaths shortly. It has not been released yet, but I'm waiting to see. In other conflicts, sometimes the majority of those killed are killed from indirect deaths. So again, we don't know the number, but there was a controversial Lancet article that said 186,000 people are going to be killed in Gaza. It was very controversial, but the way they reached that conclusion is looking at other conflicts, seeing the amount of indirect deaths per direct deaths, and reaching a conclusion. They're not saying that's how many people currently are dead. They're saying that's how many people they predict will be killed. And the way they reach that number is really connected to indirect deaths. Here's another quote from a whistleblower. There are more fatalities than are reported. We were in a small area. Every day, at least 1 or 2 civilians are killed because they walked in a no-go area. I don't know who is a terrorist and who is not, but most of them did not carry weapons. This speaks also to the fact that the death toll is likely higher, is almost certainly higher than what is being stated, and also that men are being targeted. And they speak about a no-go zone. This is where a lot of the civilians that are just being shot or executed or sniped. We do have evidence of this happening. It seems like most of this is happening in what is called a no-go area. A no-go area is an area that is meant to be evacuated. The IDF then kind of have free reign to, they no longer need permission to take shots in a no-go zone. Some are referring it to a kill zone. It's a zone where there's way more lenience with shooting those you see, because the assumption, and it's a false assumption for many reasons, but the assumption is this is no-go zone. Whoever stays must be a terrorist. There's many reasons people are not evacuating. One is they just want to defy the orders of the IDF. They're not going to listen to an invading force. Second, they might have young children at home and elderly family, and they don't want to walk across Gaza. They're hearing that the paths are not safe. There are instances of mass arrests of military-aged men on these paths. People on these paths have gotten attacked. Some will claim it's Hamas attacking, others will claim it's IDF. My point is just to show these paths are not safe, and they're going to go to a place where they're going to live in a tent with no running water, with disease and a bunch of sick people, only to maybe get attacked there because these safe zones have been attacked as well. So you could see the rationale to stay home with your young children or elderly. I'm not saying this is the right decision, but that does not give you a freebie to just take shots. It doesn't. And international law would agree with this. Now, another way to look at this, actually, I want to read one more quote just to talk about one more whistleblower quote. There are more fatalities than are reported. Oh, no, I read that. My bad. Oh, that is a disorganization on my part. I apologize. Anyways, now, another way to look at this is let's look at the amount of children that have been killed. Based on the list, the 34,000 names we currently have, there are 11,355 children, meaning people under the age of 18. In Aleppo has a similar population to Gaza. The war there was 4 years, and I'm using this because this was also primarily urban combat. It was widely considered to be a humanitarian disaster. Assad is widely considered to be a war criminal, and NATO considered invading because of this humanitarian crisis. Aleppo only had 5,261 children killed over 4 years. Israel is over 11,000, and this isn't accounting those who have not yet been accounted for, while in Aleppo we've had time to account for everybody. It's true, Gaza has a higher child population than Aleppo, not by a significant margin. And it's true that the conditions are different. But I'm using this as a reference point just to show the cost of this war, this idea that it's just being conducted so beautifully and the toll is low. Again, the children are dying at a rate orders of magnitude higher than Aleppo, which was widely considered to be a humanitarian crisis. And the difference is this is a war that's being funded by the United States. So when we see protests around the world, protests in America, people say, "Oh, this is hypocrisy. It's anti-Semitism." No, this is a perfectly legitimate thing to protest. When we look at the war in Iraq, we saw record levels of protests against the war in Iraq. George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney are widely considered to be war criminals. We saw significantly less civilians relative to population size being killed there. We saw a lower civilian to combatant ratio there and less children. And this is true of all these conflicts we could look at. We want to look at Syria. We want to look at Russia, Ukraine. By every measure we could look at, less civilians are dying relative to militants. Less civilians are dying relative to the total population size, and a lower ratio of children are being killed by significant margins. So again, this whole idea that people are upset with Israel and the fact that the U.S. is funding Israel and calling Netanyahu a war criminal, this is all very legitimate and consistent based on how we've behaved with other conflicts when we've seen a massive toll to civilian life. Now, I'm not going to say that anti-Semitism doesn't fuel these movements. It certainly does, but you could remove every ounce of anti-Semitism from the anti-Israel movement, and there would still be a perfectly justified reason to be against this. And even if you're under the belief that this is primarily Hamas's responsibility, I know that is a viewpoint. That the fact that Hamas is not acting responsibly, which they're not, and they're putting their civilians in danger, like that doesn't absolve Israel of their responsibility. And again, international law, as well as common sense, will tell you that when parties are warring, neither side is absolved of responsibility for civilians harmed that are caught in the middle. Now let's try to get an understanding of the civilian to combatant ratio. We often hear that the global standard is 9-1, 9 civilians to each combatant. This is not true. This is one of those John Spencer quotes or data points that he often points to, and many people repeat. That is not true. The average is not 9-1. In fact, I will challenge you to find me a conflict where you're seeing 9-1 that's not generally referred to as a genocide. 9-1 is not the standard. Where does this come from? The UN released a press statement where they were quoting one of the speakers that said 90% of casualties of war are civilians. That speaker is wrong. Where was that speaker getting their information from? There was a study in the 90s that determined that 90% of victims of war are civilians. Victims includes economic harm as well. Well, that makes perfect sense. But when we actually look at the data of other conflicts, again, source below, but when we look at the data of other conflicts, we see that urban warfare, not just conflicts, urban warfare specifically, because that's how you make a fair comparison, are much closer to 2-1. 2 combatants, two civilians for every combatant. Israel is much likely closer to 4-1 or even 5-1. Again, we don't know because we don't know the exact amount of civilians killed, and we don't know how many combatants have been killed. Israel says it's 20,000, which, again, there's no evidence of this, so I think it should be taken with a grain of salt. But let's say they're telling the truth, it's 20,000. If only 40,000 civilians have been killed, then we're at 2-1. But that is a very, very, very low estimate. In reality, the number is likely closer to 80 to 100,000, and we're talking around 4-1, double the world average. Oh, now something I forgot to mention, just because this list of those killed is 90% civilians, that doesn't mean 90% of those killed are civilians, right? The fact that the IDF says they killed 20K, you don't even have 20K military-age men on this on the list being released. And if 90% are civilians, where does 20K militants even fit into this whole picture? It very well may be the case that military that combatants are not being added to the list at the same rate, right? This is something I have no way to check or prove, but it very well may be the case that if you're a militant and dying, you're not being brought to a hospital, you're being buried by your unit, and the list is heavily underrepresenting militants being killed. This not only may be the case, I would say there's a good chance of this being the case. Now, again, we by most metrics available to us, we can conclude with a high degree of certainty that the civilian to combatant ratio is significantly higher than the global average, despite what many are saying. And again, I've challenged anybody who wants to debate this. You can come on after I'm done with this report, and you could debate me. Challenge John Spencer to debate. He rejected, but I'm happy to debate anybody on this. I feel confident enough in what I'm saying. Now, as we said, the conditions in Gaza are tougher. That certainly is playing into it. I don't deny that for a minute. And the precaution we are seeing is evacuations, and we're seeing also a policy at times be used called roof tapping. But roof tapping is interesting. People often cite this roof tapping as evidence of Israel going above and beyond because other countries don't roof tap to nearly the same extent. But roof tapping is only used if there's no militants in the building. If there's militants in the building, then you're not going to roof tap because then they escape. You only roof tap when you destroy a building that has only civilians in it. The other reason other countries don't generally roof tap is because they don't really take down civilian infrastructure to the same extent. They're not destroying that many buildings that are only with civilians. So this precaution Israel takes is actually a result of increased aggression. So I don't think that they deserve all too much credit. It's a result of an increased aggression and them already acting in a way that's unprecedented. Now, I want us to assess not just the harm to human life, but also the infrastructural damage, because this helps us get a bigger picture about Israel's strategy in this war and how the precautions they're taking, or their strategy is, no matter how they go about it, is going to disproportionately harm civilians. When we look at an analysis of the infrastructural damage, and this is analysis done using satellite imagery, radar, and high-resolution images, as well as field-proof geolocated data. An estimated 80% of buildings in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. There's been no other conflict with these numbers, not Aleppo, not Mosul, nothing. This is an entirely not novel and new amount of buildings damaged and destroyed. Now, you need to ask yourself, it's true that the conditions in Gaza are unique, but this is more of a reason not to destroy buildings. Combatants are underground, hiding, while civilians have nowhere to go. They can't leave Gaza. They can't use the tunnels. They don't have bomb shelters. So this heavy infrastructural damage is going to disproportionately harm civilians, not militants. Militants are able to hide from this. So this whole idea of flattening Gaza on top of tunnels it's not surprising that we're seeing a civilian to combatant ratio that's very unusual and amongst the highest in recent history. But it brings into question the strategy of causing so much infrastructural damage when those you're actually going after are hiding in tunnels. It's a cruel strategy. Even if you're telling people to leave, think about what it's like to be in Gaza, right? It's this tiny strip of land. You have nowhere to go. You can't leave Gaza. You're being told to leave your home. Your neighborhood's destroyed. You go in a tent, that might get hit. After a month, you're told you could go home, and then maybe you're told to evacuate again. The Gazan people are being sent from one place of Gaza to the next, to the next, to the next, and just slowly being hit and killed along the way. It really is a collective cruelty, unlike which we've seen in recent history. You need to imagine what life in Gaza is like for 100% of those living there. Now we'll get more into the cost and what other approaches we could take. Is there a different strategy? What could Israel actually do? We'll get into all this, but I really want us to just get a sense of how much harm has been caused to civilians while the combatants have the privilege of hiding underneath in secure bunkers and tunnels. Now, we mentioned 80% of buildings in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. This includes commercial buildings, cropland, roads, schools, hospitals, medical facilities, vital infrastructure like water sanitation and sewage infrastructure. There's zero justification to destroy water sanitation and sewage infrastructure. I would also say there's zero justification to destroy medical facilities. The claim is that Hamas are using these medical facilities. The only evidence we have is that they're using these medical facilities to get treated, not to launch attacks. There's not been any evidence, and I've looked into this, there's not been any evidence of attacks being launched from hospitals. We do know that militants use hospitals to get care. We also know that they brought hostages to hospitals. Well, that makes sense. Where are they going to get the care for the hostages, right? So the justification to destroy medical facility needs to be pretty damn high. That's a vital infrastructure that people are going to need, especially in time of war. So the evidence required to actually destroy medical facilities needs to be much higher than it currently is, or the evidence that we should expect in order to legitimize such an attack. Cropland, right? We want to talk about the malnutrition in Gaza. It's not only about the fact that there's a problem with the distribution of food. It's just also they don't have the ability to farm their own food. Roads are destroyed, right? So this is getting food from point A to point B. Less than half of Israel's 36 hospitals are still functioning, right? So at a time where you have record amount of injury disease and malnutrition, you have a record low amount of functioning hospitals. This is leading to the humanitarian crisis we're currently seeing. Now, again, even with these precautions, Israel has taken, a military's actions should be judged not by precautions taken, but by the actual harm they're causing. This needs to be the metric we look at. The harm they're causing relative to the military gain they're achieving. And let's get into the principle of proportionality, because that's what it states. The principle of proportionality, Article 515B, I don't know, that's where it is in international law, states that even if there's clear military target, it is not possible to attack if the expected harm to civilians or civilian property is excessive in relation to the expected military advantage. Now, you might be thinking this is highly subjective. Who's to decide if the harm to civilians is relative to the military advantage? It's actually subjective for a reason. This is a feature, not a bug. International law is hard to enforce. So when it was created, and this was created before we had the international courts like the ICC and ICJ. So when this was created, there was even less way to enforce it. And if it's too strict, countries are just going to ignore it. So international law is, call it, vague enough to get countries to buy in and agree to, because it's not enforceable. So, many will say, yeah, we've killed 100,000 civilians, but we have secured Gaza. That's worth it. Some might say that's worth it. Most people, I think, would agree that the cost has been far too high. And it seems like the international courts will ultimately agree with this. Most of what I'm talking about today is not a matter of international law. I will touch on that, but I'm talking primarily about morality and ethics. What is the right thing to do? What is a better approach? And just giving an honest analysis of the situation. So I don't focus primarily on international law, but I do touch on it. And it seems like the ICC, with their arrest warrant they put out today, ultimately is in agreement. Now, I often hear many people claim that all those killed are the responsibility of Hamas. I mean, it's interesting how otherwise intelligent people get really dumb when it comes to defending a side that they're just very defending their side or position that they're passionate about. It's such an illogical way to view the world. Okay, our morality should not be determined by a terror organization, right? So if Hamas has put their people in danger, that doesn't take away our responsibility to not cause harm to civilians. Why would it? All that means is we are determining our morality based on the morality of a terror organization. Let's take an analogy, and no analogy is one for one, but let's say you have a hostage situation. You have a hostage situation in a bank. You call in SWAT. SWAT determines that it's going to be hard to get them out without us losing any of our own. So you know what? We're just going to destroy the entire neighborhood. That's essentially what Israel's doing, okay? Very few people would say, oh, it's the hostage takers, they shouldn't have done it. No, we would clearly say SWAT has an obligation to try to deal with this hostage situation in a way that's not going to cause so much civilian harm. Nobody's going to think that SWAT doesn't have any responsibility. So why do we think that the IDF has no responsibility? It doesn't make any sense. And the whole idea that you could be in the belief that Hamas is a terror organization that needs to be destroyed, but also they're responsible for the lives of their people, that's not a coherent position. It's contradictory. And for a good reason, international law prohibits this. Now, let's talk for a moment about why this is important in international law. All countries, as I mentioned, are going to look out for their people more than the people of their enemy. This is consistent throughout history. Israel is not unique in preferring their soldiers over the civilians of their enemy, okay? So this would mean a good strategy, if you don't care about civilians of the other side, a good strategy is to not send your troops in to be killed. It's just to flatten the city, flatten it from above, take as little risk as possible, right? International law was created for just this reason, to stop that from happening, because it's aware of the incentives, and it's aware that all militaries will prefer their own. So to avoid militaries from destroying cities, we put responsibility on the warring parties, on both sides. And that it makes perfect sense, right? Now, the IDF strategy does seem to be similar. Yes, they have sent ground troops in and have lost hundreds. But relative to what many predicted, it's actually a relatively low military casualty count, because it does seem like they're often making decisions to act in a way that will harm civilians at the expense of putting their soldiers in danger. Which, again, it's understandable, but international law was created to prevent just this from happening. And let's get a little bit deeper into the strategy. So we can't know everything about Israel's strategy and motivations. Many say they're directly targeting civilians. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have evidence of an intentionality of trying to kill as many civilians as possible. One claim that could be made, which is a justification for harming civilians, is it acts as a deterrent, right? We do hear that a deterrent is essential. Now, if you believe that a deterrent is essential and you don't care about civilian lives, one way to achieve deterrent is to harm civilians. The more the population suffers, the less likely they are to support a future attack. This is at least the rationale. So you could actually see how people will find a rationale to harm civilians, because it acts as a deterrent. I'm not saying this is what the IDF is doing, because I don't know. I don't have evidence to make this claim. But we do know that the flatter Gaza is, the easier it is to engage, right? You have this massive tunnel network underneath Gaza. You don't know where the exits of these tunnels are. We don't know where the exits are. We also don't know which buildings the Hamas might use to attack IDF soldiers. In order to determine this, where the tunnels are and what buildings they might use, it requires a very, very careful approach, where you go building to building. It's much slower and it's much more dangerous to soldiers. So you could see the strategy to not wanting to take this risk, and let's just level Gaza. And that would explain why we are seeing record levels of infrastructural damage. You could see how this is just a clear strategy to reduce harm to your military. And then, as I mentioned, there are these no-go zones, which are often kill zones. Anybody who refuses to leave is then considered a militant. And you do have some amount of IDF soldiers that just want to get a kill. You know, there's this culture in the IDF that you want to put an X on your gun. That means you killed a terrorist. Some of the more extreme units won't say killed a terrorist; they'll just say killed an Arab. It really depends on the individual and the unit you're in. But you could see this as a great opportunity. Kill zone. They're a terrorist. I don't care. If a 16-year-old, he must be a militant. I'm going to shoot. It seems like a lot of those being shot are happening specifically in these no-go zones. Okay. I see chat's going wild. I can't look at chat because I do have notes here, but we will do Q&A and just a public conversation about this afterwards. Damn, we're already going on 53 minutes. This is a long one. Let me take a quick breather, maybe a sip of water, and then we will get into the specifics of the war crimes being committed. Okay, let's continue. So when looking at war crimes, there's two types of war crimes. There's systemic war crimes, which are actually coming from above as a command. The other are just individual soldiers breaking ranks and committing these crimes. We are seeing both in Gaza. The systemic ones are much harder to prove, but I say with a high degree of certainty that ultimately the international courts, as well as the court of public opinion, will agree that systemically what Israel's doing is immoral and constitutes a war crime. One of them is just a very low level of proportionality, right? So, meaning the low level of proportionality, meaning a large amount of harm to civilians relative to the military gain. I think it's a lower level of proportionality than we've seen in any other conflict in recent history. There was a whistleblower report from IDF intelligence officers talking about the "Where is Daddy" protocol, which essentially says if it's a high-ranking militant, we can kill them and their entire families, up to, I believe it was 20 people per militant. This is what the whistleblower report says. This seems to be corroborated by a lot of the death toll we're seeing and the amount of civilians being killed. Also, when you look at the names of those being killed, we see that there's actually a lot of full families that have just been wiped out, just full families gone. Whereas Daddy points to this being a matter of policy. Again, many will say that's fine. We could kill 20 civilians if we get some Hamas commander. Again, I don't know, we don't have enough information as to how these day-to-day decisions are being made. What is the importance of that commander? How many civilians are being killed? This is a consideration of proportionality Israel is making all the time. I believe, and with evidence, that this is way too low. Many who support Israel will say it's a perfectly reasonable level of proportionality. So let's let the international courts and international community decide. I'm confident in being on the right side of history on this one and taking a moral stance against killing 20 civilians because you're going to get a combatant. So that's one, just a low level of proportionality. The other is just the infrastructural damage. Infrastructural damage needs to be justified. If it's civilian infrastructure, you need a good justification to do it. To damage or destroy 80% of the buildings in Gaza is horrific. It plays a massive disproportionate toll against civilians. This is a systemic issue. This is a command from above. And another policy that is part of this infrastructural damage that individual soldiers are carrying out, but there's reports that it's a command, is burning homes. So if a soldier, and there's ample video evidence of this as well, that will be one of the sources, video evidence of this. If an IDF unit stays in a home, once they leave the home, they burn it down. Why do they burn it down? Just in case they left something there. They don't want Hamas to get it. So instead of taking 30 minutes to an hour to look through the home and make sure you didn't leave anything, they're going to destroy a civilian's home with all their belongings inside. It just shows the general disregard for civilian life to burn down a home instead of taking 30 minutes to see that you didn't leave anything. Right? This policy, which we've seen done by multiple units, as well as whistleblowers saying that this is a command. Let me find you the quote. Pull up the quote later, but I do have a quote talking about the burning of homes, and there's many videos of this as well as this is certainly anecdotal, but I have a friend that served in Gaza that confirmed this being the case. Cool. So this is on a systemic level, right? Just a low level of proportionality. And just massive infrastructural damage, not only to civilian homes, but to vital infrastructure like medical facilities, power plants, water plants, cropland, roads. Gaza has been destroyed. Gaza has been destroyed. Hamas has not yet been destroyed. On an individual level, what are the crimes being committed? Well, I want to just try to give greater perspective on the IDF and why we're seeing this happen, right? The IDF is relatively speaking an undisciplined military. It's primarily 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. They're not making a career out of the military. They're doing it because you need to do 3 years. compared to other nations, the IDF is very undisciplined. We also have a relatively high degree of ethnic hate, right? Israelis and Palestinians have been fighting now for over 100 years. This creates hate. And again, I want to be clear. I don't blame people. I blame systems and institutions. That's what I try to change. Humans are acting as humans otherwise would. I actually don't blame Israelis for their aggression. I blame the system that is allowing this to happen. Same goes with the Palestinians. I don't blame the individuals for believing certain things or supporting certain things. It's the systems and institutions impact how people see things. So I'd rather focus on that. You change a system, you change an institution. There's a major trickle down effect. That's the focus of my efforts. But there is a high degree of ethnic hate. There's also a high degree of anger. After October 7th, there was so much anger. That anger still exists. It pushed a lot of people over the edge. It really radicalized a lot of Israelis to the point, I don't want to say to the point of no return. I believe you can be de-radicalized, but it pushed many people over the edge to the point where some amount of Israelis started openly supporting genocide. They said, there are no civilians in Gaza, flatten Gaza, we don't care. This is not the majority, but this certainly constitutes some percentage of the Israeli population. And this is actually to be expected. This is what happens when you are at war with the population. So we have low discipline, high degree of anger, relatively high degree of ethnic hate. And you have a society that very much cherishes their soldiers. So it's very controversial to hold a soldier accountable. So you have all these things, lack of discipline, a lot of hate, but you don't have good internal regulation. We saw what happens when we try to internally regulate. When there was the alleged gang rape in this Day Taman prison, 9 prison guards were arrested. That same day, some Israelis raided the prison and the courthouse, including a politician and a member of the IDF. This was not only the most fringe people in society. There's a social and political cost to holding soldiers accountable, which decreases the amount of accountability we are going to see. There was a report that there's being 70 soldiers being investigated in Gaza by Israel, which is great. This was only done after the ICC started investigating, which just shows the importance of the international courts. The way the ICC works is if you are going to investigate it yourself, we will not get involved. So it shows that the ICC's pressure did get Israel to increase their level of internal regulation, but it's certainly not to the extent that is deterring enough soldiers from this lawlessness and recklessness in Gaza. And we will talk about exactly what we're seeing happening, but I didn't want to set the stage to understand why this is happening. So on one hand, we're seeing executions. Is an execution just putting somebody on their knees and shooting them in the back of the head? We haven't seen any evidence of this. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but people waving white flags getting shot, people who are clearly civilians or under the age of 18 being shot. We have video evidence of this. We have drone evidence of this. We have testimonials corroborating this. We have 65 doctors that served in Gaza. 44 of them reported seeing children with bullet wounds. People are being just shot. Unarmed people are being shot. What is one good example of this that really kind of solidifies some of this lawlessness we're seeing? This was 6 to 8 months ago. 3 hostages escaped captivity and were approaching the IDF waving white flags. All 3 of these hostages were shot dead by the IDF. And it wasn't just one sniper that shot all 3 of them dead. The entire unit opened fire on them. One of them started running away and the unit chased him and killed him. So it wasn't just one soldier that was acting reckless. It was an entire unit that were targeting and then chasing people waving white flags, which is certainly a violation of international law. This same unit, on October 7th, killed 4 militants, unarmed militants. And how do we know? We saw them upload a photo of 4 militants lying dead with guns next to them. But there was also drone footage that was released showing these 4 militants coming out of the bushes unarmed, getting on their knees. You then see the same unit that killed the hostages run up to them and shoot them. Executed them. They were on their knees. They executed them. They then moved guns next to them and took the photo. Right? So I'm not saying every unit and every soldier is acting this way. That's not the case. And I also want to say that a lot of this recklessness comes from a place of fear. When your life is at risk and you have close to no regard for the enemy, why would you take any risk of your own life? No, you're just going to shoot first, ask questions later, right? That's essentially what we're seeing. And some units are acting more recklessly than others. This unit that killed the hostages and killed the unarmed militants and planted guns next to them, that's certainly a unit that is committing war crimes. And there's no reason to believe that they are the only one. Again, we have evidence from different places of Gaza where we see other units, and we're seeing similar things happening. I'm not saying this is the majority. I want to be clear. It doesn't take a majority to have a horrific situation. Even if it's only 10%, even if it's only 5%, when there's no accountability, that is all too many and going to harm civilians. What else are we seeing on an individual level? We're seeing theft. How do we know theft is happening? Because IDF soldiers are literally uploading videos of themselves stealing stuff. And this also speaks to the lack of discipline. If we look at the amount of videos that have come out of Gaza, it's quite unprecedented. We have videos coming out of Gaza of IDF soldiers committing war crimes. They're uploading their own war crimes to social media. Think about that. Think about how courageous you need to feel or how confident you need to feel in what you're doing, and that there won't be consequences or backlash, not consequences from the military or social backlash. They're going to upload a video of yourself doing something that is either immoral or just straight up against international law, like theft, like property damage. We're seeing a lot of videos of people destroying property, including medical equipment. We're seeing dehumanizing behavior like wearing lingerie of Palestinian women. We're seeing prisoners being dehumanized, being left in uncomfortable positions, being tied up, and then photos taken of them and uploaded to the web. These are all things that IDF soldiers themselves are uploading to social media. And we know that the most horrific things are not going to be filmed and being uploaded. But this does speak to the level of the lack of discipline and the lawlessness we are seeing. And it shows that by and large, the society is going to either be okay with it, either support it, or at the very least turn a blind eye. Because if there was a social consequence to this, they wouldn't feel that same confidence uploading it on social media. Now, I want to talk about just like try to tie this all together, right? How we're getting to this situation where we're seeing just an unprecedented amount of war crimes and very little accountability. President of Israel, Herzog, on October 12th, 2023, and important to say that president is more of a symbolic role. It's not, you don't actually have a political role. It's more symbolic, but it's an influential role in Israeli society. In a press conference, Herzog said it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. And we will fight until we break their backbones. This is a sentiment that many Israelis believe. I mean, the fact that the president will say this at a press conference, this was not considered controversial by Israelis. Many agree with this. So clearly, if this is your mindset going into Gaza, you're not gonna take civilians into consideration, right? Polling shows that over 70% of Israelis don't think civilian well-being should be taken into consideration, to either no extent at all or to just a little degree should be taken into consideration. And this isn't unusual, right? I think this is going to be similar numbers when any two parties are warring, when there's a high degree of ethnic hate. But we do see that the population, generally speaking, don't think that their well-being should be taken into consideration. Some amount of Israelis, and there is no polling on this, do believe there are no innocents in Gaza. We see this from social media posts making this claim that are, get thousands of likes on it. People are, many people support this. Well, if you're serving in Gaza and you think there's no innocents in Gaza, what are you then going to do if you know you could get away with it? Right? It should be hard to see why we're seeing these levels of war crimes. It's the conditions are ripe for this happening. And again, I don't blame people for having these views. I really don't. These are my family members. My family members hold these views. But when people have these views and there's so much anger and so much pain and so much hate, there needs to be a higher level of discipline and a higher level of accountability. There has to be. This needs to be an expectation of us for warring parties, that soldiers going into combat need to be held to a high standard. They have to be. Another thing that was, also points to just the lack of care. There was this Dayteman case where, again, there's alleged gang rape by 9 prison guards, but there was a report put out by Breaking the Silence, I believe it was, where they interviewed 54 people who were released from Israeli prisons. There's not one prison. There's 18 prisons that detain Palestinians. They released 54 people spanning all those prisons, right? So they got some data from every prison. The fact that these people were released is a sign that they're innocent. You generally do not release terrorists, certainly not during war. So they were released. That should point to us that some amount of these people being released, some amount of those being arrested are civilians, generally military-age men. And what these people said shows that it's a systemic issue. It's not just Dayteman. No one else reported sexual violence, but all of them reported horrific conditions, torture methods like being left in a light room, being left in uncomfortable positions, being made to stand, well overcrowded. Some mentioned physical abuse. Again, it's a systemic issue across the prison system. By the way, the prison system is controlled by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who many would consider him a fascist. He's certainly a far-right extremist. So he has direct impact over the prison system. So it's not surprising why we're seeing a systemic issue in prisons, where we're seeing horrific abuses towards Palestinian prisoners, some Hamas, others innocent. And it doesn't matter if you're innocent or not, you should not be tortured, right? It's almost not relevant that many of those being tortured are maybe innocent. Let me just read a few more quotes just to get a better sense, again, from IDF whistleblowers. There was a total freedom of action, said B, another soldier who served in the regular forces in Gaza for months, including his battalion's command center. If there's even a feeling of threat, there is no need to explain. You just shoot. It is permissible to shoot at their center of mass, not in the air. It's permissible to shoot everyone, a young girl and an old woman. B seems to be referring to the no-go zones, which we spoke about. This is the general sentiment. In the no-go zone, you can just shoot. Another whistleblower says, shoot first, ask questions later. That was the consensus. No one will shed a tear if we flatten a house when there was no need, or if we shoot someone who we didn't have to. Another quote, it is forbidden to walk around, and everyone who's outside is suspicious, B continued. If we see someone in a window looking at us, he is a suspect. You shoot. The perception is that any contact endangers the forces. Any contact with any Gazan endangers the forces. And a situation must be created in which it is forbidden to approach the soldiers under any circumstances. The Palestinians learned that when we enter, they run away, right? So we are seeing the complexity, right? How a lot of what's happening is not just hate, a lot of it stems from fear. You are going to value your life, your friends' lives, over those of the enemy. So if you see a Gazan coming near you, maybe it's a 16-year-old boy, maybe they need help. They very well might be suspected of being a militant, and in many instances are being shot. Another challenge is a lack of external regulation. The US, for the most part, is supportive of Israel and would continue to fund Israel. We have seen some change in European countries that have distanced themselves from Israel and spoken against the war. This is a positive sign, and also a sign that protests work. Countries such as Italy, Japan, Spain, Canada, Netherlands, and Belgium have ceased the sale of weapons to Israel. This is great news and shows that protests work. But the United States still very much will support Israel with what they do. And when you don't have a lack of internal regulation, when you have a lack of internal regulation and a lack of external regulation, it's a recipe for disaster. Another thing is Israel does not pay for their weapons to nearly the same extent as other countries. They're heavily subsidized by the United States. Either they get weapons entirely for free, or they get funding that is then meant to be spent on US weapons. Now, every time you drop a bomb, that's expensive. But if you only need to pay for a fraction of that, you're actually incentivized to drop more bombs. Now, so again, I want to make it clear. Countries respond to incentives. Israel has a unique of incentives causing it to act like this. This doesn't absolve Israel of responsibility, but in order to change situations, we need to understand incentives. So let's really summarize this, right? You have a war that is being led by Benjamin Netanyahu, somebody who many will agree, most I think would agree, has interest in a prolonged war so he can stay in power. In order for him to stay in power, he also needs to appease people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, far-right radicals. Right? So it's being led by somebody who we probably shouldn't trust, who needs to answer to those who certainly do not care about harm caused to Palestinians. They're leading the war, sending in a military that lacks discipline, that has a relatively high degree of hate. You have no internal regulation, or low internal regulation, and a lack of external regulation, and heavily subsidized weapons. This is a recipe for disaster. All we need to do is look at the incentives, right? The disaster in Gaza actually could have been predicted before it happened simply by understanding the incentives at play. We could have simply looked at these incentives and predicted quite accurately what we're currently seeing. So it's essential to understand incentives, and by understanding incentives and how to change them, you change systems and institutions. That's why we need to focus on this. But again, a war being led by Netanyahu, who needs to appease Ben Gvir and Smotrich, sending in a low-disciplined army that has a high degree of hate, fear, and anger, lack of internal regulation, lack of external regulation, and heavily subsidized weapons, that is a recipe for disaster, and that is exactly what we're seeing. So what do I suggest? What's an alternative? What could we do differently? Okay. So my first suggestion is going to be, call it a bit more radical. Radical in the sense that the world is almost not even ready for this, but I'm saying this because I believe this is where we need to move towards as a species if we are to make progress. October 7th happened, which was absolutely horrific. And Israel has the right to respond. They do. A sovereign nation has the right to respond to such an attack. But we could have been quite collected and rational about it and analyzed the situation and said, okay, we now have 250 hostages in Gaza. If we go in militarily, what is sure to happen? We know we're going to lose soldiers, our own soldiers. We know we're going to kill many civilians. We know there's a high chance we risk not getting the hostages back and even killing them in airstrikes. We know it's going to take a toll to the economy. We know it's going to isolate us internationally. And we know there's a chance it creates more wars on other fronts. But we don't even know for sure if this will destroy Hamas. Right? So we could predict a whole lot of negativity, a whole lot of bad without guarantee of success. So we could have decided based on that, engaging them militarily in this way is not in our best interest. Not to mention, this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted us to engage them militarily in this way. So we could have recognized the cost it would have. Oh, I didn't even mention our economy, right? The blow it took to our economy. Our credit rating's been reduced twice the past year. Brain drain happening in Israel, right? Israel's top talent, those who contribute the most to the economy, are leaving. A lot of this could have been predicted. And only so we could try to defeat Hamas and try to change the status quo. No guarantee of success. So we could have looked at more diplomatic means. We could still engage militarily, but we can be much more specific with our attacks. We could do highly precise attacks only on militants, kind of like how we assassinated a lot of Hezbollah with relatively low toll to civilians. We could have done things like putting international pressure on Hamas to return the hostages. We did have the sympathy of the international community for a few days, which we lost once they started seeing videos of dead children. We could have played the long game and understood that we don't have a way to defeat Hamas right now. The cost is going to be too great. Well, let's just continue with the trend of the Middle East that's warming up to Israel, right? We now have normalization with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, soon to be Saudi Arabia, and who knows who's next. Maybe if we have a coalition of Middle Eastern countries who recognize Israel's right to exist, we could put necessary pressure on Hamas to reform and change their ways. I get it. I understand the world is not quite ready for this approach, but it's very important for me to say this because I'm confident this is where we are going to move as a species. Human progress depends on us continually improving the care we have for civilian lives. So in the future, actually being rational about it and not reactive and not thinking they hit us, so we need to hit them harder. These are all very primitive, primal things. I truly believe we will grow out of it. So me, as somebody who wants to see the world go in that direction, I am putting that out as an option. That is a viable option that needs to be considered, that not everything needs to be dealt with militarily, especially when the military cost is so high. Now, let's assume we do go in, and I understand this is the general consensus that Israel should go in. Okay, well, if we go in, one thing we could do is have a much higher degree of care for civilians, actually have a much higher level of proportionality than we currently have. We could have given civilians ample time to evacuate Gaza. And people like to say, oh, no one would take them. Well, that's our responsibility to figure out. I'm sure we could have negotiated something. We could also let women and children into Israel and built a refugee camp in the Negev. It's true living in a refugee camp isn't good. It's true that taking in an enemy population is not favorable, but it's certainly preferred to killing them. And we often talk about Gaza Hamas education, how bad it is. Well, if you let women and children in, you have an opportunity to actually show them a different side and give them a different education, and to start building ties with these Palestinians the same way Palestinian citizens of Israel are generally speaking citizens and integrated, not to the highest degree possible, but we have seen the capacity for peaceful coexistence when you're not growing up thinking that we are the enemy, and when your only experience with us isn't airstrikes and bombs, right? So the civilians are our responsibility. They are our responsibility. So we could have, again, try to evacuate them, either bring some amount into Israel or find a different country to evacuate them into. That's something that we could have done. I don't accept the fact that, oh, they have nowhere to go. That's no, that you're not absolved of responsibility. Another is we could have done done a whole lot without entering Gaza so deeply. We could create a massive buffer zone, right? We could systematically create a buffer zone without sending any troops in, taking ample time to evacuate the surrounding areas around Gaza, and create a many kilometer buffer zone to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Also, this buffer zone gives you negotiating leverage. We also could have kept vital infrastructure intact, like hospitals, cropland, and water plants, right? We did not need to destroy this stuff, right? So we could have said, we're going in Gaza, but we're not going to destroy hospitals. We're not going to destroy cropland. We're not going to destroy this vital infrastructure. We're not going to do all this damage to homes. And if we're sending soldiers in, we need to hold them accountable for war crimes. So whether we go in or not, there's certainly a whole lot we could do differently. And the world has every right to expect this of a warring country. And just a little bit more about like I want us to really think about like the philosophy around war and what it means to kill civilians, right? Most people will agree that humans deserve the right to life, that this should be a fundamental right we have to live without it being taken from us. And all of a sudden, when there's war, we're like, oh, it's just war. That's collateral damage. We have agreed that some people can lose the right to life because there is a greater mission at hand. Well, that's something pretty serious, right? To say that people are going to lose the right to life for a greater mission. And I acknowledge that there are some greater missions that very well might be worth some amount of collateral damage, and again, collateral damage is taking away a civilian's right to life. That's what it is. And I could see a situation where the benefit of war is great enough that taking people's right to life is worth it. But what are we actually talking about here? Hamas, on their most successful day in history, killed 800 civilians, which is horrific, but they don't pose an existential threat to Israel. Israel could have prevented another attack with better security. Again, we have a right to defeat them, but if the cost of defeating them is 100,000 dead civilians, hundreds of our own, a total of the economy, being isolated internationally, if that's the cost of trying to defeat them, when we could prevent it with a better security, because October 7th was our failure more than it was our success. It could be prevented with better security. So when you have a solution to your problem, the problem being an insecure border, and you could achieve that solution with killing close to no civilians, and you choose a solution that will kill 100,000 plus civilians, that's something very serious, and we shouldn't take that lightly. And if we are going to act in a way if we are going to choose an approach that's going to kill civilians, well, that's the military that should be led by somebody who we trust, who's not self-interested and just wants to stay in power. Have it be led by somebody who doesn't need to appease far-right voices in his cabinet. And we need a higher level of accountability if a country is going to engage in war. Again, to decide that you could kill tens of thousands of civilians in order to prevent another attack, that's a very serious decision, not one that should be taken lightly. And I do think that in the future, we will look back on how Israel is engaging in Gaza, or just modern warfare in general, Syria, Iraq. We will view these conflicts and see them as completely barbaric, similar to the barbarity of October 7th. We have this idea that, oh, when you shoot somebody at point blank, it's barbaric, it's evil. But when you kill a family with an airstrike, oh, that's just war. That framing, how we see things, that's going to change. That almost certainly is going to change. We're going to see that this operation in Gaza is absolutely barbaric and immoral. There's no doubt in my mind. So yeah, we have a horrific situation in Gaza. We have an unprecedented unprecedented amount of children killed, civilian population killed. We're seeing disease and malnutrition. Hamas is still in power. We don't know how much in power in the sense that they're still alive and able to hit us. They're not near being defeated. It's unclear how many more years we will need to stay in Gaza. And yeah, people are rightfully upset. And I'm hearing a lot of talk that anyone criticizing Israel, it must be anti-Semitism. How dare you not let Israel defend themselves? It's perfectly legitimate to be against this. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Again, does anti-Semitism fuel the anti-Israel movement? Without a doubt. But to just say it's anti-Semitic to be troubled by what Israel's doing, you're doing a major disservice. You're diluting the meaning of the term. People don't take accusations of anti-Semitism seriously anymore for this reason. And I'm also troubled by seeing how many fellow Jews are just denying what's happening in Gaza. And I get it. You don't want to acknowledge that a country that you love is doing something wrong. I get it. But us Jews, more than anybody, should understand the pain that comes with atrocity denialism. It's been done to us forever. People still deny the Holocaust. People still deny the atrocity of October 7th. So we should understand better than anybody the pain that comes with atrocity denialism. So to see so many fellow Jews who are just denying what's happening in Gaza, it's hard to see. It really is. So I think we'll end it on that. I know what I say may be upsetting to many people, but I hope that you put your anger not towards me, who just wants to see less people dying to see Israel thrive, but put it towards the war crimes being committed and the actions being taken that are harming civilians. This should trouble you. And even if you don't care about Palestinian civilians and you just care about Israel, well, this is putting Israel at risk. Israel is losing international support. Our economy is taking a blow. We can't deal with multiple fronts at once. The past year should have shown us Israel's vulnerability. And if you care about Israel, you should recognize that the only way to ensure our survival on this land is through peace. Living by the sword will ultimately be our demise. We need to find a better way. I hope to see the end of bloodshed soon enough. And more than anything, I just want to see peace on the land. I want to see Israelis and Palestinians living side by side with one another, as I know we can. So I'll leave it with that. We'll do Q&A. We could have people come on. I didn't realize it would take an hour and a half. That was a long one. And we will prioritize super chats. If anybody wants to support the show, feel free to give a super chat. I know there's a lot of conversation that I missed because I had notes. But if there's any important questions, please ask. If anybody has a super chat, please drop it. Right, we have Carl Clayton here saying such a lie. Hamas and Hezbollah are responsible for each and every civilian death. That's not how the world works. Nobody actually believes that when you think about it. Common sense and international law completely agree with that sentiment. What do you mean it's only their responsibility? So let me ask you a question. Let's say Israel would assess the situation in Gaza. You're like, you know what? The only way to deal with this is to nuke Gaza. Would you just say that's a lie? Hamas and Hezbollah are responsible because they started it? It really requires like a childlike level of emotional maturity to reach a conclusion like that. I'm going to be honest. Like I don't want to be too harsh, but like that's literally the emotional maturity of a kindergartner would think that way. It's his fault. He's responsible. That's mature adults don't think that, and for obvious reason. How do you destroy the tunnel system? This is a question by Steffi Schwartz. Either you keep it intact because the cost of destroying it is way too high, or you're very systematic about it. You're very systematic, house to house, tunnel to tunnel. Now, it's also possible that in the future, in the near future, with drone warfare and robotics, Israel can find a way to deal militarily with Hamas that will really reduce civilian harm. And I know that there's something dystopian about this, but we do need to see this as an actual possibility. Let's say Israel has an army of drones and robots. We're not all too far from this happening. That can be extremely precise in the shots that they take, and it's not a life being lost. You could literally have a situation where a drone army can deal with Hamas in a way that will find tunnels, and you could deal with Hamas and find tunnels by minimizing civilian harm. Right? We're not there yet. Let's be honest. Like, we're not there yet, but we are getting to that point. This whole idea to destroy Gaza now because this is the best way we could think to do it. It's not. We shouldn't accept that. Cool Maps, thanks for the 10 Canadian dollars. Cool Maps goes, really great stuff. Are you considering a dedicated talk stream on the scale of decimation to infrastructure, buildings, etc. in Gaza? Well, I do talk about that in this stream. So if you go back a bit, you'll see that I review the infrastructural damage that has been caused. Are you saying you'd like an even deeper, a more thorough review on that? Because I'm open to doing that if there's some demand. And thanks for the $10. Really appreciate that. We Pope says Adar, is there a double standard towards Israel? There's no coverage of Sudan, for example. In a sense, I mean, it's hard to know if it's a double standard because they're just very different. Like when something's happening with a Western country, there's more focus on it. When something's happening with a Middle Eastern country, there's more focus on it. Historically speaking, right? Syria dominated the news cycle for a long time. So there's countries that just in the West are generally considered more relevant or more important. And when they're involved in conflict, it's going to be focused on more. Also, Sudan is not funded and armed by the United States, right? So right now, Westerners and a lot of the Western world is in alliance with Israel, either has trade deals, weapon deals with them. This is a Western nation, that's committing these atrocities. It's not a conflict within Africa. So for good reason, it's going to be seen as very different. Another super chat, €5. Thank you so much, Imagination Scene. How would you respond regarding people like Dr. Avi and Honest Reporting questioning the numbers? Not watched all and not sure whether you covered that. Yeah, so again, anybody that's trying to cast doubt on the numbers is being intellectually lazy and either intentionally misinforming the public or they're being intellectually lazy. And I hope that this is a stain on their legacy for being an atrocity denier. Generally, what people are doing is they're pointing to there's a few different approaches people take to discredit the numbers. One, they say Hamas controlled Gaza Ministry of Health, therefore anything they say just can't be trusted. Not only can't it be trusted, they're most likely lying, right? That's one narrative. They don't know that the list they're releasing is verifiable and historically accurate. Either they don't know or they're just being dishonest about it. So that's one claim. The other is even the UN changed their numbers. and there was, I think it was back in April, the UN was reported 70% of those killed are women and children. And they changed it to 60, and they changed their methodology. And people are saying, you see, the Gaza Ministry of Health is changing their numbers. But that's not what happened. The UN was reporting, taking numbers using the Gaza Media Office, not the Gaza Ministry of Health. The Gaza Media Office is also reporting on casualties, but they don't release a verifiable list. So I personally take that with a grain of salt. The UN was using their numbers and then decided to switch to the Ministry of Health because they're more reliable. Once the UN did that switch, people then used that against the Ministry of Health. They said, you see? And people wrote articles about this saying, people wrote articles debunking the Ministry of Health based on reviewing media office numbers. The sloppiness that requires, or the dishonesty that requires. So that's generally where the debunkings are coming from. Or they're pointing to the fact that the Ministry of Health uploaded incomplete data and then they completed it. They're saying, you see, look at all this missing data. They're just making shit up. But that's not a coherent hypothesis. They could just make up numbers. Why put in incomplete data and then change it when there's scrutiny from the whole world? Why would they do that? Clearly, there's better explanations than them just making up incomplete data only to complete it in the next report. So that's generally those casting doubt. And I'm happy to debate anybody on this topic. Anybody trying to cast doubt, any atrocity denier, I'm happy to debate them on my channel, on a different channel. No problem. So I hope that answers your question, Imagination Scene, and thank you for the €5. Somebody's asking my views on what happened in Amsterdam. Well, let's start with the fact that you shouldn't attack people violently. Like, that's just a good rule to live by, unless you absolutely have to, right? Violence should always be a last resort, not a first resort. So those who attack the Jews are guilty of crimes. Now, was it a pogrom? Were they just targeting innocent Jews? I'm not sure. We did hear that there were some amount of Israelis that were ripping down Palestinian flags, that were damaging property, that they were acting recklessly. I mean, look, Israelis are notoriously bad travelers. Like, there's an arrogance when Israelis travel that's very embarrassing, I must say. It's embarrassing, but you go to any like major tourist place where Israelis go and ask the locals living there, and yeah, Israelis are good for the local businesses, but they'll acknowledge that there's an arrogance that they don't often respect the population and that they're a part of. So to think that, like, right now, when there's all this anger at Israel, for Israelis to come waving Israeli flags and pulling down Palestinian flags, I mean, you're inviting such an attack. That doesn't justify the attack, but that is entirely irresponsible conduct. Now, it's possible that, again, you very well may have a situation where, like, let's say a group of 10 Israelis were the ones doing this, and then people heard about it, and then any Israeli just started getting attacked. Like, that's clearly pointing the problem with collective blame. With collective blame and just attacking any Jew or any Israeli because of the actions of some. Clearly that's wrong. But again, respect the culture you're part of, especially now, especially when there's all this animosity towards Israel. To go waving the flag and ripping down Palestinian flags, like, what do you expect is going to happen? And again, this doesn't absolve the responsibility from the attacker. Oh yeah, actually, interesting situation, right? The person who said that all the deaths are Hamas and Hezbollah, they're not going to say that the attack is Israel's fault, but the Israelis' fault for instigating it, right? Here, they're going to understand mutual responsibility. Here, they start to see the world like a regular human being. They're like, oh yeah, I mean, the Israelis shouldn't have done that, but you shouldn't attack them. They're gonna be able to understand that both sides are responsible for the situation. But it comes to this, it's like, no, Israel's innocent. It's just Hamas and Hezbollah. We very clearly see this cognitive dissonance. It's really an inability to see things quite logically, how we generally look at things. The boss is saying that the Amsterdam mayor herself said that this was not a pogrom and that the Israeli government pressured them to propagate the narrative. Interesting. I didn't see that confirmed, but that is interesting. Ed goes, Ministry of Health standard of counting casualties are higher than any other conflict. Yeah, well, they're higher than any other Ministry of Health. That's for certain. I started looking at how reporting is done in other conflicts. The Ministry of Health is the most meticulous out of any Ministry of Health in how they report, at least based on other conflicts that have been at war like this. Yeah, without a doubt. Yoel, you're asking what is your min max range for belonging? Is that a question for me? I'm unsure. Now, does anybody want to hop on and talk, share questions, or challenge my presentation? I'm happy to drop a link. Just let me know in chat if you'd like to come on. See any more questions? Q&A. Any more super chats? Guys, don't worry. Like I'm not going to go hungry without super chats. I don't rely on this. It just any money I make through YouTube, I invest back into the channel. I pay people to help me do more content, like doing the clips and whatnot. So it's very much appreciated. Steven Schwab, you would like to come on. I'm dropping a link. I see you're messaging from Facebook. Okay, I just dropped the link. Anybody can join. I'm not going to do this too long. I didn't realize this report would take so long. I'll probably do another 15 minutes and then we'll wrap it up. I just dropped the link if anybody wants to join. Pop says you're too socially anxious to go on call. Look, I understand that. That's perfectly reasonable. It's funny because, often when people, I hate arguing with people on Twitter and other social media platforms. It's just so unproductive. So I'll often challenge people to debates and they very rarely take me up on it. And I get it. You could even like not wanting to come on and debate publicly isn't even a sign that you're scared or don't believe your position. Like there's many considerations. So I don't hold it against somebody for not wanting to challenge me. But I do realize that it does put them let's call it's a convenient tactic for me to just challenge everyone to debate, knowing most won't agree, because then it makes them look bad. So here's me acknowledging that I use that tactic as a way to just end online conversations with an upper hand. Scarlett is saying, translating from Hebrew, I will translate. She's saying, I don't know why you think you're better than all other Israelis. You're going to be on the train with all of us. Scarlett, first of all, I don't live with that level of fear. I recognize that trauma very well may have led you to the point where you think we're going to be put on a train, or that the chance of us getting genocided is very high, and that I somehow think I have a moral high ground and that's what's going to spare me. No. If Jews get genocided, I don't think I'm going to be spared because of my moral outlook. And I don't think I'm better than Israelis. I don't think your views make you better. My views because of my upbringing, my environment. We're all products of our environment. I don't blame Israelis for how they view the world. I don't blame humans for humaning. So you fundamentally just don't understand my worldview and how I see things. I feel privileged that I was able to reach a place where I have what I believe to be moral clarity on this issue. I'm privileged. I don't deserve credit. I feel privileged that I arrived to this point in life. Yes. But no, I don't think I'm better. I view it as a great privilege and I'm happy I reached these conclusions, but I don't blame people who didn't. Now Scarlett is asking if I get Iranian money, because you just can't believe that somebody can reach these conclusions on their own. That if you're anti-Israel, you must be supported by Iran, or you must be an anti-Semite. The lack of creativity to somehow reach that conclusion, that there's no way to be against Israel unless you're a hateful person. Come the fuck on. Like, seriously. Seriously. We pop. I see you here, but if you don't want to turn your video on, at least give yourself a thumbnail, just for the aesthetic. I don't like when we got no thumbnail going. Okay, it seems like Scarlett struggles with saying Israelis go places and act entitled. Bro, you go places, you are Israeli. What in that statement made you believe that I'm saying this is true about every single Israeli? What world are you living in, Scarlett? Obviously, that's not every Israeli. Many Israelis travel and don't act entitled, but generally speaking, there's a stigma around Israelis for obvious reasons that we have an arrogance to us when we travel. This isn't even debatable. This is widely agreed upon, even in Israeli society. We know that Israelis are notoriously bad travelers. This doesn't mean all Israelis. Who would think that? Lucky King is asking an interesting question. Why have you reached this point, Adar, as opposed to other Israelis? What in your environment caused this? You're a minority. I don't know if, it's so circumstantial. Like there's so many factors I don't even know, because I'm not at, this didn't come from my family. Yeah, I was raised like to be compassionate and think critically, but both my parents do not have this worldview on things. So I've had even a similar environment to Israelis or pro-Israel people that reached very different conclusions, because you have like environment, but you also have something innate, right? We all have a different genetic makeup. Is it possible that my genetic makeup for some reason makes me a little bit more averse to violence, or less triggered by, like, it's unclear, but I will tell you how I see myself as innately an outlier, because I think there are, like, I reflect on how I reach these conclusions. So I'm less triggered by things. Like I don't get super emotional about topics. I feel like I am able to view things quite objectively. I also am good at disassociating myself from the pain of others. So I could be deeply empathetic and feel the pain of those around me, but I also know how to disassociate when it's not convenient. And I think it allows me to analyze situations pretty rationally. It's also possible that, taking psychedelics has helped me open my mind to the world and understand that we're all connected and violence is bad, right? It could be use of psychedelics. It could be as simple as just meeting awesome people who have helped open my mind to things. So, there's like nearly infinite different factors that play into who you are and how you think. Some are innate, all the rest are environmental. But even two kids growing up in the same family are still meeting different people, experiencing different things. So you're going to have outliers in anytime you have a situation like this. I hope that answers the question. Steven, you're asking where the link is. I dropped it in. Okay, We Pop, we're bringing you on. We Pop, welcome.
Hi, Adar.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Full disclosure, I'm Israeli. Um, and I think I have been lurking for quite a while. Uh, I sort of became really hopeless about the whole situation, and I wondered, like, I guess you thought about it a lot, but like, as an Israeli, what can I do to improve the situation, I guess? Like, I feel like I would want some action to feel like at least I could do something to improve the situation somewhat.
Mm, right. Yeah, I've had a lot of pro-Israel people reach out to me recently as I've gotten more vocal against the operation in Gaza. A lot of Jews around the world have reached out to me saying that they want to speak, but they don't know what to say because they don't want to add to the demonization of Israel, right? They see that the world is against Israel, so the last thing they want to do is contribute to it. And they also are scared of whatever backlash they might receive. Would you say you're in a similar position to that?
Um, yeah. It's also one of the things that really bothers me is the democracy. Like I do feel that what Israel is doing is maybe bad, but it's not very different from Saudi Arabia or Syria or Sudan. And while I want to say, it's bad, it's not uniquely bad. Like I do feel that maybe genocide is a bit unfair without also giving that to Saudi Arabia, for example. But I do want to send a message that this is bad. We should be doing better, and we shouldn't be supporting the current conduct how it is,
Hmm.
while not demonizing Israel and certainly not demonizing Jews and Judaism.
Right,
And it's
right.
very hard to find that fine line. So
Yeah.
far, I've just been silent, but I do want to put out something.
Yeah, I hear that. Just on one point, I don't think actually this is comparable to other situations. Even if we look at Syria, and we need to like we need to recognize that Syria was very much in the news cycle for a long time. It was widely considered to be a humanitarian crisis. NATO considered invading Syria in order to topple Assad, and the pretense for that was a humanitarian crisis and human rights violations. Syria, if we look at the numbers and the death toll and the civilian to combatant ratio, it's not even close to what we're seeing in Gaza. And there's a
Mm.
general consensus that Assad is a war criminal. So to be upset with Israel doing worse while being funded by the US, it's hard to it's hard to say that's hypocrisy or double standard. I think this is a unique situation where we're seeing unprecedented levels of destruction with US and Western support. So, yeah, again, and I will say that anti-Semitism fuels this movement, but you remove anti-Semitism from it, there's still very legitimate reason to be upset. Now, I don't call it genocide. As critical as I am, I don't call it genocide because that is a legal term. The ICJ did not refer to it as genocide. I don't claim to know more than the international courts. But I do think that, war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think it's even fair to call it mass murder, even though mass murder is not like a legal term in the sense like for countries. I think it's a good activist term because killing civilians in mass, generally we would consider that murder. I think if we want to convince others of the moral challenge, the the moral challenge with what we're seeing, defining it clearly as murder, I think is actually helpful. Again, this isn't a legal analysis. It's we generally agree that killing civilians is murder. When you kill them in mass, we call that mass murder. When a country does it in mass, we call that collateral damage. I don't accept that framing. I think we need to change that framing. So, as someone who's trying to change the way we view war and casualties, I'm okay with saying it's not genocide, it's mass murder. Or it's not genocide, but we're seeing war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's language I find to be more accurate generally. Um,
Do
now, in
you
terms,
differentiate? Sorry. Do you differentiate between? So, like, there was the example that you gave of the IDF seeing it as acceptable as X numbers of civilians per Hamas commander. Do you see it as equivalent of how Hamas specifically targeted civilians versus the idea of being indifferent to civilians while they're going after Hamas. I personally feel that it's two different things, being indifferent versus going after a civilian. But
Right.
maybe
Yeah.
you feel that there's the same.
I think that's I think it's actually I'm going to take you off the stream because I'm actually never mind. I'm recording this locally. It's you bring you bring up a very good question. Are they targeting civilians or are they just targeting Hamas and civilians are in the way and they don't care all too much about that? I haven't seen evidence of intentionally targeting civilians. It's not easy to provide evidence of this, but I haven't seen evidence of this. But the difference between targeting civilians and having general disregard towards civilians is not all too different, the result, right? So if we're going to say now that we are going to destroy Hamas and generally speaking, not care much about civilians, it will be hard to distinguish between that approach and targeting them intentionally. So I can understand the confusion why people think they're being targeted intentionally or people just don't know because it's very hard to distinguish between those two things. Trying to defeat Hamas without caring much for civilians will seem like civilians are being targeted, right? So I don't know what the case is. I don't see much incentive or reason to target civilians because there is a cost to civilians dying. Israel does want the international community to be on their side. They need continued support from the international community. So it doesn't seem like they would have an incentive to try to maximize civilian harm. And I think if they were trying to maximize civilian harm, we'd see a much greater civilian death toll. So it seems that they are targeting Hamas with little regard for civilian life, and that seems indistinguishable from intentionally targeting civilians. Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, real quick, Stephen, I see you're here, but it says device is not connected, so I can't bring you on stream. So you're gonna need to bring some connect your device. So, but we pop out. There's one part of your. By the way, how do I pronounce your name? Is it we?
You could just say Neve. Neve. That's my
Neve.
name.
Oh, your name's Neve. Okay, cool. Neve. So, one part of your question that I think is maybe most relevant is how can you do something about it? If you don't feel comfortable speaking out against Israel, I can understand that. One thing you could do is to just try to build ties with people on the opposing side. You know, try to engage in conversation and not even public conversation. Like you could even DM somebody and try to build ties with them through DM and share your perspective and listen to their perspective. That's very powerful. And again, it doesn't scale as easily, right? You're only going to change one mind at a time, but that does have an impact. And if millions of Israelis did that, it would have a noticeable impact. Another thing is you could really talk about what Israel's doing, but also in a way that doesn't. So you could say, I don't support what Israel's doing in Gaza, but that doesn't mean Israel doesn't have a right to exist. In fact, I think it would be helpful if more people were publicly saying this. Right now, those who are leading the critique of Israel are those who wish to see Israel cease to exist. Those who want to see Israel thrive
Yeah.
should be leading in her critique, right? We need to determine the narrative of the critique of Israel. So we could say Israel is doing horrific things in Gaza, yet Israel has a right to defend itself and Israel has a right to exist. We should be leading this narrative. So if you do want to speak publicly, I think that's one approach you could take. And another is to just really, meet people, like DM them and build ties that way. And if there's ever somebody you meet that you want to have a public conversation with them and do it on stream, I'm happy to host that.
All right. Cool.
Omar Offman, I see you're here too. Please add a thumbnail before hopping on. Cool. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah. So, how, like, how early did you get the impression that like Israel is going too far? Like, uh, Like, at what point
Yeah.
would you say that,
Well,
wow, all right, Israel really needs to? For me, it was really when the three hostages died,
mm, mm,
from the friendly fire. I
yeah.
was like, all right, something here is really wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just interested, like, when did that happen for you?
Well, after seeing Israel's past operations in Gaza and seeing what results they yielded relative, like what benefit they provided relative to the harm they costed, I generally viewed our response by airstriking Gaza to generally be counterproductive. So I held a similar belief right away that Israel is going to engage in a way that is not in their best interest and not in the best interest of Palestinian civilians. That said, I didn't I didn't know how bad it was initially. I said, okay, just more airstrikes. And then once we started seeing the numbers coming out of Gaza, the first list the Ministry of Health released was, I believe, after a month, and it was like 9,000 people were killed in the first 3 weeks. The first 3 weeks were by far the bloodiest. It's slowed down significantly. But when I saw 9,000 in 3 weeks, like that was shocking. 9,000. That's 10x, around 10x what they killed on October 7th. We've already killed, and we're nowhere near finished with it. And then once I started seeing videos of IDF soldiers, um, that they would post themselves of them doing just things in Gaza, it was clear of the lawlessness we're seeing. And then, as you mentioned, 3 hostages being killed, that also was a big moment. So I didn't support it from the beginning, but as more information came out, it became abundantly clear. And again, and once I started researching it, and then I said, look, I'm going to get to the bottom of this because we're hearing all these claims, lowest civilian to combat ratio in history, whatever all these claims mean. I said, look, I might still be against the war, but it's possible I'm against the war that Israel is actually conducting in the best way possible. That was definitely an option, right? It doesn't mean I would support the war, but I would have still been able to publicly recognize and acknowledge that Israel is going above and beyond to reduce civilian harm. I did the research and reached a completely different conclusion. So I want to be clear that I would have been against the operation regardless, but I would have no problem giving Israel credit if they were really conducting themselves in the best way possible.
All right. By the way, am I blocking someone else or
We do want
uh,
to bring Omar on. Omar just added a thumbnail, so yeah, we'll bring Omar on, but feel free to share some final thoughts.
so just one more thought. So the demand that is coming from the pro-Palestine side is usually an immediate ceasefire. And actually, there was just now a UN resolution that was only vetoed by the US demanding an immediate ceasefire. But doesn't that remove any incentive from Hamas to release the hostages? It basically just gives Hamas more time to prepare for another October 7th, and then goes all of Israel's leverage to release the hostages. And well, Hamas will
Um,
probably just do another October 7th, won't they?
so Hamas they have an incentive though to release the hostages if they could get prisoners back. That's why they take them, right? So Hamas has been willing to release the hostages since October of 2023 was the first time Sinwar came out and said put forward an all for all deal. It was all the hostages for all the Palestinian prisoners. I agree that's not a favorable deal for us. That's a whole lot of prisoners, many of them with blood on their hands, getting released for the hostages. But just so we're clear, there was a deal on the table weeks after October 7th. That deal has constantly been changing as the conditions on the ground have changed, but there's always been a hostage deal on the table. It would just require us to end the war. So, as much as many are saying, we're prioritizing the hostages, in reality, Netanyahu and Israeli leadership are prioritizing defeating Hamas over the hostages. So when the UN calls for an immediate ceasefire, I don't think they're saying Israel should just withdraw unilaterally, no questions asked. You could have a ceasefire while troops stay in Gaza. It's just a cessation of action while you negotiate a hostage release deal. And again, Hamas is not going to agree. They're unlikely to agree to release the hostages if it doesn't mean the end of the war. They've been very clear in that demand, but there is a way to get the hostages back. What there isn't a way, or not no clear way, is to get the hostages back and defeat Hamas. These are contradictory goals. Many understood this to be contradictory from day one. But if we want to keep fighting them, we're likely to keep losing hostages until there's none left. If we want to get those alive back, it would require Hamas to remain in power. And I get it. There's no easy decision here. There's no easy decision.
Do you think that there's a way to decrease the likelihood that there will be another October 7th given Hamas is in power? They promise that there'll be more October 7th if they'll be in power.
Yeah,
Do you think that it's possible to get around that?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think October 7th was military. It's a security failure on our part, by and large. So better security, better defense, without a doubt, could have prevented it. It's also like right now, it's going to take them a long time to rebuild. We're talking about many years until they're even ready to attempt something like that. And again, their attempt will fail if we have better security. It was a major security failure on our part. Intel got it right. Intel warned it was coming. Our intel did not do a bad job. It was the security was just not good. We saw they were coming close to the fence. We saw they're doing drills on the fence. It was reported not only by intelligence but by people in the Israeli military. Even civilians saw some suspicious activity. And a week before October 7th, we moved 2 brigades to the West Bank because things were heating up in the West Bank. We left their border insecure when a time that there was reason to believe that an attack might happen. And again, I don't, people say it's a conspiracy that Israel let it happen. I don't think that's what happened. I think it was arrogance. It was arrogance. We believe, let them try. They're not going to succeed. We got this, right? But we can't be arrogant. We need to understand that they might, like if they remain in power, we need to understand that they might try it again, but they're not going to succeed. They will not succeed. We will secure our border. We do have the ability to secure a border against Hamas. I believe that very strongly.
So you're saying that even a rebuilt Gaza with Hamas in charge, if the people in Israel will be in charge, we could guarantee with 99% certainty that October 7th won't happen again. That's what you're basically saying.
Yeah. I'm confident we can prevent it.
Don't you think that's a bit arrogant? Because I personally have no faith in the IDF after October 7th. Like, I don't trust them at all. I'm just wondering, where's your confidence that Israel can prevent this from happening again?
Because I think it's a mistake that we will learn from. I think that it was such a bad military failure that we will ensure it doesn't happen again from better security. It's not that we tried to secure the border and failed, right? If we really made our best effort and failed, I would agree with you that why should we have confidence that next time they'll succeed? But I mean, now that we know that they're capable of doing that, there's no reason to have the border be that insecure, or to let them do drills on the border, or to not take intelligence reports more seriously, right? And I get why intelligence reports aren't always taken seriously, because they're always coming in, right? We've known that Hamas wants to do an attack like this for years. It's been talked about. This isn't like a new concept. Invading Israel territory and taking hostages there's been a possibility of this happening for years. Intelligence have been reporting this under. So I do get that we don't always take intelligence reports super seriously, but now we need to. Now we need to understand that there is a chance that they will try something like that again, and we just don't make the same mistakes we made last time. And again, and I'm not even saying we could 100% secure it, but I'm saying I think we could secure it to 99% secured, and maybe deal with minor infiltrations. Again, it sucks that this is the reality, but avoiding another October 7th, I think, is entirely possible.
Okay. I just don't feel comfortable if there's somebody else who wants to go on and I'm blocking them. So just
Yeah,
let
we
me
do
know
have
if
some more
somebody else
people.
is ready.
But Neve, thanks so much. And I know you mentioned in chat that you have too much social anxiety to do this, but you did great. So it was great having you on, and I'd love to have you join again in the future.
Very cool. And thank you for doing this. I would not go in public at this point talking against Israel, because I do feel that a lot of the criticism is unfair.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, we have to say at some point, Torah Neshek, it needs to mean something. And I'm trying to find a way to convey that message. So thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah.
Torah Neshek, by the way, means in the IDF, I guess you know, but I'm talking for the audience. It means I don't know how you say it in English, to be honest. Maybe you could explain it better than I do.
What's the term?
Torah Neshek, like
What's the
purity of
first word?
arms.
What's the
Tohal,
first word?
Tohal, purity of arms in English.
Purity of arms. No, I'm actually not familiar with that terminology.
So it's basically talking about the fact that we have to be pure when we do war, essentially. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not what we're doing now at all,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
Yep, I agree. Well, thank you, Neve. We'll catch up soon. Thanks. So we're gonna bring on Steven first, and then Omar. Steven's been in queue longer. But real quick, Steffi Shorts asked, Adar, what are your blind spots, i.e., weaknesses in your analysis? Well, I would say one weakness is just that there's a lot of things we don't know. So I could only reach conclusions by I need to make some assumptions, right? It's not purely data driven because there's a lack of data. So that's why I try to look for corroborating evidence before making claims. And when I give a range of civilian death toll, I give a broad range. But that would be a weakness, I would say, just lack of complete data. In terms of my blind spots, I might be a little. Hold on, I'm getting a call. In terms of my blind spots, I might be like I promote this approach of nonviolence, and it very well might not work out in practice, right? Like I propose an alternative way of going about things, and it is possible that attempting that might actually fail. It might not work, and that I'm just a little bit too hopeful and naive. Like I could see that argument being made. I do think, though, that you should always go to the path of less harm and exhaust all options before going down a path that we know is going to cause harm. So I'm unapologetic about taking this more hopeful, even some would say naive approach, because I think exhaust all options before we're going to decide to kill innocent people. I hope that answers your question. Stephen, we're bringing you on.
Can you hear me?
Is it Stephen or Stefan?
Stephen.
Stephen, how are you? It's been a long time. We used to chat back in the day, I recall.
Yeah, we did. We chatted. We did some years ago. I put a post in the comments. You're not going to have time to study that now. I'd like you to do that later, but I'm going to run through it really fast. Okay?
Sure.
I've been advocating for the Negev as a safe haven since 2014. The Israelis are not going to do it. They weren't going to do it because Hamas breached the fence in who knows how many places. Well, that was the initial thing. Okay, we know all about all that. So what happened next is that the idea, what happened next was that Egypt decided to close their border, to close Rafah, which basically meant that the civilians were trapped in the war zone. So the IDF went to the UN and sat down with UNRWA and told them that they wanted to build the humanitarian zone at Al-Mawasi, which is along the coastline. I'm sure you've heard of it. There's no tunnels there. It's like a beach area. And they wanted to, supply and protect that camp so civilians could go there and wait out the war away from the war zone. UNRWA refused to cooperate. Okay, now, refused to cooperate with the IDF. Next, I'm best friends with the leader of the opposition to Hamas in Gaza. Now, you can believe that, or you don't have to believe that. That's a long conversation that we have to have, but his family went and put the tents up at the camp at Al-Mawasi. And when we saw, and then we wrote to Gallant and the American Embassy explaining what needed to be done. It's all in that post. We didn't get any response from the Israelis. And when we saw that they weren't responding, he went to UNRWA himself, and they turned him away. So what ended up happening is that the camp wasn't supplied. I'm sure you've read about it online. You could go Google it and you'll see it's not a safe place. Hamas has infiltrated. They've bombed the humanitarian zones. They've bombed the UN, the UNRWA schools, all these things that you see in the media. And I would go every time children were killed. I would go to my friend and say to him, this is so upsetting. And he would explain to me that UNRWA was allowing Hamas into those facilities to set up shop. This must have happened 10 or 15 times during the war, So it's like, from my point of view, the whole civilized world is complicit in the sacrifice of these children's lives. Because that was a war strategy for Hamas from the beginning, and UNRWA was complicit. I don't know what else to say.
Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I think you highlight the challenges and how, if I'm going to call what we're seeing mass murder, well, Hamas is complicit. They're accomplice to murder or murders themselves. It's the Gazan population are stuck between a rock and a hard place, one being Israel, the other being Hamas. It's horrific. Certainly. I don't see how UNRWA can actually push back against Hamas. What are they going to do? Say no? It's not, I'm not even sure UNRWA is at fault here. If a militant says we're going to come into this safe zone, UNRWA has zero capacity to do anything about it. So I don't even blame them. But yeah, Hamas is culpable in the destruction we're seeing in Gaza without a doubt. Them in Israel.
My point is, even if you're going to say that UNRWA doesn't have the capacity to resist Hamas's moves, you still have to point the finger to the international community and the United Nations, who are like seeing these children. I mean, it was horrifying. For 12 months, trying to get these civilians out of a war zone. Me and my friend, my partner, Palestinian. Seeing the videos and seeing every day, it was just overwhelming, and you're yelling and you're looking at this and saying, come on now, where the Ukraine, the war in the Ukraine, you have 6 million refugees sheltering in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
What is this keeping 1 million children inside of a war zone where they don't have bomb shelters and you have an enemy that's embedded in the civilian population?
Right.
What kind of humanity is this?
I agree. Israel should have, before entering, worked with the international community to ensure mass evacuations. We certainly should have done that.
But they did. They went to Egypt. The United States and Israel went to Egypt and said, listen, let them shelter. They didn't even talk about.
That's not the only option, right? Egypt's not the only country in the world that could.
Well, the only other option are other countries. When Netanyahu was interviewed during the war, and he would always give his statement that for us, it's a tragedy, civilian deaths, but for Hamas, it's a strategy. It would infuriate me because not single interviewer said to him, hey, what happened with the humanitarian zone? You declared, the IDF declared a humanitarian zone a week and a half before they entered Gaza. Mm-hmm. They declared Al-Mawasi a humanitarian zone. The UN refused to cooperate. So my question to Netanyahu would have been, why didn't you go further? Why wasn't your language from that day forward confronting the international community and saying, hey, nobody's taking the Gazans out of Gaza. So we tried to create this zone inside of Gaza. It was negligence on the Israeli part. That's where I say Israel was negligent. As far as killing civilians, it was inevitable. You have 2 million people in a densely populated area with militants dressed in plain clothes embedded within the civilian population. You can't target the militants without killing people.
Right, but
Innocent people.
the fact that Israel was not able to evacuate civilians, which I don't think they tried nearly hard enough, but the fact that they were unsuccessful, that is a factor they need to take into consideration when entering Gaza. They need to understand the amount of civilians and the amount of children that are in Gaza.
No, but if you go to,
they need to change their strategy given that factor. Like, it's a relevant factor.
Well, yeah, but if you go to the Kogat site, you see, and not only that, because I speak every day to my friend who's got 50,000 people on the ground in Gaza. Their evacuation warnings and started on October 8th, and they didn't cease. Every time that they carried out a military operation, they issued evacuation orders. So then you have to ask yourself, why aren't the civilians getting out of the areas where they're talking?
But Stephen, that's not entirely true, because you don't evacuate a home that has militants in it. So a lot of the civilians that died were killed alongside in the same building where there might have been a militant or suspected militant. You're not going to evacuate. You're not going to say, okay, we know there's a militant here, please everybody leave, because then the militants leave, right? So there was a lot of evacuations. But there's also just a lot of, we get intel that there might be a militant there. He's there with his family, his extended family of 20 people. Let's go for it.
Right.
That's
don't get me wrong, man. I believe that there should be war crimes trials.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not defending criminal actions.
You're just pointing to the challenging conditions, and I agree. It's the most challenging.
If they violated the laws of armed conflict in terms of proportionality, they have to be taken into account for it.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Well, today the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. I still haven't been able to review it, but I'm interested in seeing what claim they're making. But I think it's great, and Hamas. They're also war criminals, and we should hold war criminals accountable. It's important to make progress as a species to hold war criminals accountable.
No, you're right about it. But a caveat to that is, like, every time that children would be killed, I would go to my friend and I would say to him, look, man, it's just, and he would insist that the IDF doesn't target civilians. And he's lived through 4 wars in Gaza. And he insists. So, because you were speaking about it before. So, yes, we have a case of either Hamas holding civilians in certain areas, or just people happen to be in certain places where IDF made decisions to kill militants. Sometimes probably not like such important people, and like you said, whole families were wiped out.
Right.
So, it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think we're in a position to be able to come to a verdict about it. I think that there have to be, cross-examinations of witnesses who were brought. I went to UKLFI, which are the lawyers who were defending Israel. I finally got in touch with Natasha Hausdorff after 10 months, and they say they cannot bring witnesses to testify at the ICJ. I don't know how the only other thing you can do is requisition the logs from the Israeli Air Force.
It should be investigated. It will be investigated, and we'll certainly get more clarity. But we do have enough information available to make certain conclusions, right? That's like the basis of my report. And you know what? If information ends up coming out that changes things, and I happen to have been wrong with anything I said, I'll come out publicly and make a correction, as I always do. But I spent months looking at this before making any of these claims. I generally don't say things with confidence if I don't know for sure. So I think at least the claims I made about war crimes being committed, civilian-combatant ratio, death toll, I say with a high degree of certainty I'm on point about it. But yeah, let's see. Let's see once the dust settles.
Have you considered debating John Spencer?
Yeah, well, so Kim Iverson interviewed John Spencer, and before she interviewed him, she reached out and said, can we bring Adar on? He's a former IDF. He sees things differently. He refused. Again, I don't know what his consideration was, but he refused to debate. I've challenged him on Twitter to debate. He's not getting back to me. Look, I'm not that big of a name, so I get it. He might not.
I'm gonna write to him because I've been in contact with him. I'm gonna write to him.
If you please, don't even frame it as a debate. Say a civil conversation between former IDF and current U.S. military, good faith conversation. I'd be happy to do that. And if he's not willing to, I'm going to create a video debunking him because he's destroyed his legacy. I'm confident of that. The things he's saying are just not grounded in reality. But yeah, if you could reach out to him, that'd be awesome. I do want to bring Omar on just because I need a wrap. But
all right,
Steven,
man.
Thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Talk soon. Omar, what's going on?
Hey Adar, thank you for everything you do, man. We appreciate your channel. We appreciate your approach. Like the objective approach that you try to like stick to. So like quickly, I think like I don't have time. So like quickly, like two issues or three. Like I want to just raise quickly to follow up on like the previous two people who joined the stream. So the first thing about the an important thing like you keep saying over and over again, which is we don't have an evidence that they actually target civilians, and maybe they're just trying to target militants and they're just negligent in terms of not sparing civilians.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think that is the case. So like for example, if we start with the like easy to demonstrate case, which is like cutting the aid, like cutting the food and water from Gaza, that one is a direct targeting of civilians and using starvation as a weapon of war, isn't it? So the army or the military that does that, why is it a far stretch that they would kill a civilian, or like they would see civilians, know that they're civilians, and kill them in order to whatever pressure Hamas or to create more pressure there. The other thing is when we say like there's a genocide happening there's a genocide happening. So like mainly like what we mean is like what people understand, which is like there is a mass killing, usually of civilians, for the intent of like raiding an area of them or like to get rid of them there. I think at the beginning of the war, the Israelis, when they started the campaign, I think it was pretty clear that the killing and the very high rate of killing, especially of civilians, it was clear that they were hopeful that we're gonna push them out of Gaza, maybe to Egypt. We're gonna reduce the population there, and we know for a fact, like if you know the Intercept report, that Netanyahu's goal for Gaza is to thin the population to a minimum, and that he tasked one of his top advisors in order to achieve this goal. Are you aware of this report?
No, I'm not.
Like if you just look up like the Intercept, Netanyahu thinned the population to a minimum. That was at the beginning.
Send it. Can you send it to me when you get the chance? I'll definitely review it.
Yes. So that's the first one. The other one is like as we speak right now, what's happening in northern Gaza. I think it's pretty clear that yes, like when they started the campaign, the thing that they started with is like they started by striking the wells of water and the bakeries there. They've completely cut aid, and they have started doing the killing and trying to evacuate the people from there. And this time we know that it's different. This time we know that there's no intention to allow the people back. They're trying to get to rid northern Gaza of the civilian population. That's why we call genocide. Like tonight, what happened in northern Gaza?
No, but that's not that. Making people leave northern Gaza, and if they're not allowed to return, then that's ethnic cleansing by definition. Yeah. That's certainly ethnic cleansing.
Yeah. So I'm being clear with what I'm saying. I'm saying using the mass killing of civilians in order to achieve this goal. So if you're doing ethnic cleansing, using the means of mass killing, especially of civilians, that's what we call genocide, isn't it?
I think it
colloquially, at least.
Politically?
Colloquially.
Oh, well. When I read the definition of genocide, it has like a long definition, and there's so many factors that play into it that I understood that this is like a complex legal definition that I don't pretend to understand better than the ICJ. So that's why I'm saying I defer to the ICJ. If they're going to call it a genocide, then I have no problem to agree with that. I don't pretend to know better than them, but I have no problem saying crimes against humanity, war crimes, and mass murder. These are all things where I'm not going against some legal definition and disagreeing with an international court. It's also much harder to contest. So there's often debate. People say it's genocide. The pro-Israel side will say, no, it's not. Then you're fighting over terminology. Whenever there's contested terminology, I kind of push it aside and try to use like more generally agreed upon terminology. That's much harder to defend against. So
that's really a very unfortunate part of the conversation, which is
just real quick, because I could defend that it's mass murder much easier than I could defend that it's genocide, right? So why do I want to defend terminology? I want people to understand the horrors of what's going on. So I view it as just a better, more straightforward way to explain it. But I'm not like, if you want to call it genocide, I'm not going to argue on that point. Like I don't think the distinction is important enough to argue. But I know if I were to use genocide, then I would be caught up in semantic arguments rather than the actual situation. So that's why I choose that approach.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate in terms of the word genocide specifically, because as I said, like colloquially or like generally speaking, when people say genocide, doesn't mean necessarily the technicalities of the legal definition, and you need to actually prove the like the intent to a very high standard.
Sure.
Yeah,
but colloquially, but generally, it's not. If we don't want to look at it legally, it's generally used to say the intentional destruction of a population. So like the intention to reduce the Gazan population. And, let's say we've seen 100,000 civilian deaths. Israel has the capability to kill everybody in Gaza. So that's why people are pushing back on the colloquial term of trying to destroy population, because Israel, if that's their intention, they're being very slow about it, right? 100,000 in a year when they could do 2 million in a year. What kind of a genocide is that? That's the pushback of the colloquial usage of genocide, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I understand where they're coming from. If we apply this, for example, to northern Gaza today, I think that doesn't really refute the other point. Like even if the number of people killed is not like 50% of the population or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Still, if you're targeting civilians, killing them in like large quantities, and your intention is to try to get rid of them in a certain area, I mean, that's what I would call a genocide, and like people would call a genocide, and that's what people mean when they say genocide, generally speaking. And I think like what's happening in northern Gaza right now is exactly that, I think. So if you watch the news, like every other day there is like they throw a bomb into like a residential building that hosts like tons of lots of displaced families, and they kill like dozens and dozens of them. Like tonight they killed, like in just one bomb, they killed like 66 people in one residential building. Many of them are women and children.
Mm-hmm.
So the approach that I don't like that you guys take is maybe they were convinced that there is a Hamas militant there, and maybe there is intelligence. We don't know. We can never know. Why do we give them the benefit of the doubt? We already know that those are the people who use starvation and use food and water as a weapon of war. We already know, for example, like when we talk about the aid trucks, and when they started like targeting aid trucks and killing people seeking aid from the aid trucks, it was consistent. It was like almost every day or every other day at a certain point, and people kept saying, we don't know, maybe they knew that there is a Hamas member there, maybe they thought that there's militant there. That is not the case. Aid trucks are cleared, they get the okay, their route is determined, they still target them. So I think even for you, until now, you're skeptic that that's the case, right? That they target aid truck for the purpose of targeting aid truck in order to pressure.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's not happening, but I don't have enough evidence to make that claim. I'm very careful with making an accusation.
Yeah.
So that's why in my report I explained that you could see an incentive for a deterrent in the form of targeting civilians. So it's possible. I'm not saying it's not. I certainly see an incentive there. I just don't have enough evidence to say I know Israel is doing that. Like I know they're doing other things.
Good. Let me give you actually an evidence. I'm gonna see if this evidence is gonna convince you or not. Mm-hmm. The World Central Kitchen. You're aware of what happened then?
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
What do you think most likely happened? Why? Why?
I don't think that I don't think was intentional, because that was very controversial, and Israel had to admit they did it and admit it was a mistake.
Yes.
And that's not the kind of thing they're likely to do. They're not going to intentionally hit those trucks and then say, "Oh, we made a mistake."
Good.
They're much more likely to hit things that won't be reported on, like aid trucks and whatnot.
Good.
So I don't think that's the.
But that's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah.
How about if I tell you the ones who give the command are religious fanatic Jewish settlers? Those are the ones who give the command to target the air trucks, and those religious fanatic Jewish settlers, they personally, they advocated for cutting the aid. They implored the Netanyahu government not to get aid in, and they sent even a letter there that we must stop aid from getting in. If that person was the one who gave the command,
how do you know who makes the commands? Because we're talking about
you know, I'm breaking the news for you right now. Unfortunately, mainstream media did not speak about this.
No, I mean send me a report. You know, I'm certainly open to being convinced.
So they fired 2 people. So it's on the Telegraph. It's even on the Wikipedia page. Like if you go to the Wikipedia page of the incident, like they fired 2 people, 2 commanders. The senior one of them is a religious nationalist, is a West Bank settler, religious nationalist, who sent a letter to Netanyahu before imploring him that please stop getting aid into Gaza. When this person gives the command to go kill the aid truck workers there, I'm not gonna say, oh no, it's not of the benefit of Israel. It's bad PR. He did not intend. You know what I mean?
So Omar, if what you're saying is true, if the person who commanded the attack on that convoy, it's determined that they sent a letter to Netanyahu prior saying we shouldn't let aid in, I think it's fair to conclude that attack was intentional. This probably isn't going to be enough evidence in the court of law, but I think in the court of public opinion, it's a fair conclusion to reach. I personally didn't see that was the case, but please send me a link because I just sent it on
the private chat. It's
I see. I won't be able to read it now, but I definitely will check it out.
Like if you read it there, it's like it's obvious. I think like it's very obvious. Yeah. So I think it's not exactly the IDF is just a coherent body, and when they mess up or do something bad, they do it intentionally and they calculate for the PR or for the international pressure. That's not how it works. There is a big enough mass of the IDF, of those like religious fundamentalists, the crazy settlers, and the mass of them in the IDF is big enough that consistently we see the targeting of aid trucks, and it's obvious that there is no real justification. Even Israel, when it tries to cover up on this, they like there is nothing convincing actually out of it. The consistent high number of children shot in the head, the consistent targeting of civilians, we're using the drones. The drones that are specific, they see with the cameras as if they play video games. Like,
no, that's but there's some misconceptions there. I've been looking into the drone thing. Again, you can make the case that what's happening in Gaza is horrific. I'm not going to be convinced to call it genocide until the international courts do. Yeah. But I don't think I'm the one that needs to be convinced. You know, I'm convinced it's bad. The thing with the drones is we don't have actually any evidence of drones that can shoot people. It doesn't exist in the world. We don't see that this is a technology that exists. Israel didn't report on having it. They export weapons to all over the world, and there's been no discussion about a drone that can shoot. What is likely happening, because it's true, a lot of people are saying they're being shot by quadcopters. What's more likely happening is the quadcopters are providing intel, right? They're seeing what's going on, and then snipers are taking shots. So what people on the ground see, they see a quadcopter, and then someone gets shot, and so they just assume it's the quadcopter. In reality, it's a sniper that uses the quadcopter for intel. This doesn't mean it's okay if they're shooting innocent people. But I just want us to be accurate with how we're presenting things. Yeah. We don't have any information about an armed drone shooting people, but there does seem to be a correlation, a pattern that when there's a drone around, people are getting sniped. So that's likely what's happening. It's giving coverage and intel, and they're using that to shoot.
Yeah, it is my mistake framing it. When I spoke about the drones, I meant the videos that we know about the drones, bombing people or like throwing a bomb.
Oh, those drones.
Yes.
Yeah. That we've seen some. I do think that the most horrific war crimes are not going to be done by drones, because drones, it's all filmed. So you actually need to film yourself committing a war crime. But we have seen some drone footage of pretty horrific things. Like there was a boy that was hit by a drone.
Yeah.
People came to rescue him and they were all hit.
Yeah.
Like that is clearly a violation of international law.
So, for example, this one, why do we give them the benefit of the doubt? Yeah, the one who did that, the one who was in control of the drone, it's obvious he knew that he's killing civilians. It's obvious that he did it intentionally. I'm not going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he thought that is Hamas.
I agree. But for it to be genocide, that would have had to been a command he got, right? Yeah. So I agree that whoever did that, that's a horrific war crime. They should go to jail. That's murder, as far as I'm concerned. If they got a command from above to do it, if that's a matter of policy, then I think you already have pretty strong evidence of genocide. I do. I just don't know if that came from above.
Yeah, that's fair. The other one that I wanted to bring up is like the consistent, like tanks running over people, dead and alive, and we've spoken about it, that they're running over people. No one listened. Mainstream media in the West, it didn't even catch it. Like we had like pictures of like a human body that is basically turned into juice, and you see their hands are like there's handcuffs on their hand, but the body is just like was run over by a tank. And we spoke about this over and over again. No one caught it. And then when the IDF soldier, when one of them took his own life, like committed suicide, and CNN posted the article that he left Gaza, but Gaza didn't leave him, and they tried to humanize them. In the report over there, he speaks personally about how, quote unquote, hundreds of terrorists, quote unquote, hundreds of terrorists, we were running over them, dead and alive. Okay, so the elements who do this, they're and again, the same person. What does he mean by a terrorist? Basically, just any Palestinian male. If you look into it more, so like, why do I give them the benefit of the doubt? Yeah, they're literally running over people alive. Yeah, they're targeting people, run over them. I'm gonna say that maybe Hamas, maybe there is some strategic benefit. Maybe I'm not gonna give them this benefit of the doubt. The other thing,
I think that's actually a great point that I did not mention in my report that is worth mentioning. That, as you said, the CNN article reported that a tank commander committed suicide. His friend reported that he was traumatized from running over hundreds of what he described terrorists, both dead and alive. Regardless of if those are all terrorists or some are civilians and some are terrorists, that's also a violation of international law.
Yeah. No, the thing is that on the end of the Palestinians, there's been some incidents. Like we know that they are civilians. The witnesses said that they are civilians, etc., and they were run over. And we speak about it, but like again, there is no evidence. You can't really conclusively prove sufficient evidence to prove this, but like that they are actually not militants. But
we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah. One more point that I wanted to bring up is like the Haaretz report like 2 days ago or 3 days ago about the aid trucks now. So Israel, like the total amount of aid trucks that got into Gaza for the last month or so, or a little bit more, it's the lowest since the beginning of the war. Even like at the beginning of the war, like we did not really have this shortage of like food and water. And like after the pressure of the US and after the pressure of the international and after the ultimatum of Biden and all of this, we got like, I don't know, like very few aid trucks get in, like very, very few. And those aid trucks were targeted by the gangs and targeted by those armed forces. That was under the watch of the IDF. The IDF not just let it happen. The IDF they targeted the security forces that belong to the government of Gaza, which is like Hamas led. That was a long time ago. Okay, after they were killed, the tribes in Gaza they did a committee, and together they established a force to secure the aid convoys. That was like months ago. The IDF or the Israelis, they contacted them. They wanted to do a collaboration so that like hopefully those are the people who are gonna take the civil matters of Gaza after the war. They refused. After they refused, they targeted them. They targeted their centers. They killed 40% of them, and then this committee, it went out there saying that we've been like targeted in this direct way. We're not going to be able to do what we're tasked to do. We're not going to do it anymore. So all of this is like purely Arabic media. Western mainstream media, they did not catch on this. So okay, a consistent pattern with this is the Haaretz report. Like if I read from the Haaretz report, like if I tell you this without citing Haaretz, you're gonna tell me like you're just a crazy person. Like in the Haaretz reports, it says that right now the gangs that Israel is letting take the intercept the air trucks, like some of them are affiliated with the Islamic State, with ISIS. If I tell you that Israel is using or facilitating the work of ISIS in Gaza to disrupt disrupt the air trucks, and in order to pressure the civilians and to use food, I guess if it's civilians are gonna tell me that like, that's really hard to believe. That's what's happening again. Why is it hard to believe that IDF, that Israeli government, would target civilians at the same place? You know what I mean? I'm just talking about like the benefit of the doubt that we always give them. Does this make sense, Adar?
Yeah. Certainly. I'm personally not in a position where I'm going to reach conclusions based on like when I'm missing information about a number, I could present a range to account for the fact that I don't have all the information. When it comes to an accusation of a crime, it's very hard. There's no range there, right? I could say the likelihood I think it's of happening, but there's still certain things that there's a lack of evidence, so it's hard for me to come out and make an accusation. That doesn't mean I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's that I'm not reaching a definitive conclusion with the amount of evidence I have available. But I think everything you're saying is super important and relevant, and you know you're further strengthening the point of the horrors we're seeing in Gaza and of the war crimes being committed. And you know I hope all of this is investigated and we get a much clearer picture.
Yeah.
So I'm actually not denying anything you're saying. I think you're speaking truth. I just don't know how. I still can't attribute intention. I don't know what level of command it comes on, right? Is it coming from above? Is it individual soldiers? That said, we do know there are systemic war crimes being committed, and we do know there's war crimes being committed by individual soldiers. I think at this point, that is those two statements are undeniable. They're undeniable.
Thank you for giving me the time, like making the points.
Sure, this is great, and thanks for all these links. I'll definitely read through them, and happy to do another longer stream with you if you want, so we could go deep onto all these topics.
I would be happy to. I would prepare cool. The references. I would prepare all of the stuff that the Western mainstream media didn't really catch, and yeah, I would be happy to.
Yeah. So, are you Palestinian?
I am originally from Palestine. I grew up in Jordan.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks again for coming on. You emailed me, right? We've spoken via email?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So we'll chat via email. We'll find a time. I'd love to go deeper on all this stuff. So thank you for coming on.
I appreciate this. Thank you very much, Adar.
Talk soon, Omar. Cool. We're going to wrap it up. Maybe I saw one more comment that's just funny. Easy B goes, why is my video quality so poor right now? What's going on? Is it just me, or can you all see that? Anyways, Easy B goes, war crimes can only be investigated after the fact, so there are no rules during war. Hamas appeared to not prioritize the people they govern, but appear to expect Israel to. That's just complete and utter bullshit, my guy. Like, there are no rules during war. That's demonstrably false. Their international law exists. Geneva Convention exists. These are laws during war. What does that even mean? There are no rules during war. Obviously, there are. And let's say Hamas doesn't care about their people. That doesn't absolve Israel of responsibility. If they're a terror organization that needs to be destroyed, how can they also be responsible for the well-being of their people? That's not a coherent position. Our morality is not dependent on the morality of Hamas. The fact that they don't care doesn't mean we don't care. That doesn't make any sense. So it's factually wrong what you're saying, and it's just not in line with common sense and how people generally view things, and for good reason. Anyways, I think that's a good place to end it. Imagination Scene says, are they using drones for scope? I believe that's the usage of drones. The drones themselves are not shooting. There are drones that drop bombs, but actual sniping drones, it doesn't seem to be like that's happening. So they're giving intel, and then there's snipers shooting. That seems to be the case. Anyways, thank you all so much. I know this wasn't an easy stream. I know there's a lot of difficult information here. But it's important. We need to hold power wielded irresponsibly needs to be kept in check. It is essential. The more power you have, the more responsibility you have, and it's up to us, the people, to hold these powers in check. For Israel to thrive the way I believe Israel can thrive, there needs to be a transformation, and part of that transformation is having these challenging conversations. And we could be secure on the land without killing so many civilians, and I'm not going to accept the death and destruction of a population and of a city as necessary for our survival. I don't accept that. Yeah, wishing for peace on the land. Thank you all. Sorry again for the blur video. I don't know what the hell happened. Who knows? But maybe it's some internet connection. Sending love. See you next week for another stream.